1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is now time for another edition of the most disruptive show in those states. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines in the news this morning. First of all, COVID update. As of Tuesday, 8.2 million people in America have gotten the virus, and 220,800 people have died from it. Tuesday night's World Series opener between the LA Dodgers and Tampa Bay Rays had the lowest attendance since 1909. That's over 110 years. There were 11,388 attendees, and two new peer-reviewed studies, one being the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, found that mortality has dropped among hospitalized patients by 18% since the pandemic began. At the start of the pandemic, patients had a 25.6% chance of dying. Now that number has declined to 7.6%. That is a significant drop. That's a more than two-thirds drop there, which is great. Yesterday, the Justice Department sued Google for antitrust violations, alleging that it abused its dominance in online search and advertising to stifle competition and harm consumers. There are ongoing investigations of other major tech companies coming, and potentially antitrust lawsuits coming against them too. Those companies would include Apple, Amazon, and Facebook at both the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission. Google responded via tweet saying, quote, "Today's lawsuit by the Department of Justice is deeply flawed. People use Google because they choose to, not because they're forced to or because they can't find alternatives," end quote. Jamarl, the major comparison that people are bringing up, of course, is what we applied our last big batch of antitrust lawsuits to the era of the robber barons. What's your take on yesterday's events? Where do you think this is going to go?
Where it goes is difficult. I mean, Google is like $1 trillion, that Alphabet has like $1 trillion, so they can dump tons of money into the lawsuit. But good. I mean, Google has gotten, these tech companies are far too dominant. I mean, think of, and it makes sense, right? I mean, Google makes an amazing product, amazing search engine that scores above everyone else. And then they get with other tech companies like Amazon or like Netflix or some of these other big companies, and they make deals. And those deals basically edge out smaller companies that want to get in because those smaller companies can't compete. Now, Google has every impetus to do this, every incentive to do this, and so they go towards it. I mean, companies have a tendency towards monopolization. It's in their interests of sorts. It's the government's responsibility, supposedly, to step in. And so in this case, they step in. One interesting point, though, the people who were bringing this case, to the people who joined it, all of them were Republicans. I think it was like 12 Republican attorney generals, if I'm not mistaken, when I was doing the story yesterday. But it's a fascinating story. It's good, the antitrust. This sounds like it may just be a first step meaning if they're successful with this, they may go further into like advertisements or maybe even into Amazon's anti-competitive practices. It's like we'll put your product on the market, then we'll, come up with a way to make that product cheaper, undercutting your product, those type of things that go on. So no, I think it's a good first step. Now, the question is, do you see this happening in a Democratic administration?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, probably, because I think it's not. I'll give you two other competing motivations here. One is they're trying to put pressure on big tech companies to do more of what they politically want them to do, and that includes suppressing certain types of political speech. That's theory one. And then theory two is they're doing this to extract money from them. They're after post antitrust lawsuit, post whatever happens here. Google might have to introduce some cosmetic changes, but it's possible that what's going to happen is they do that and then just pay billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, whatever, to the federal government in some form or another, and everybody walks away more or less satisfied. The status quo pretty much maintains itself, except that some money has changed hands. Both of those seem very possible to me, and it could be the case that all three of the things, the two explanations I gave, and the one that you were given there, those could all be true at the same time.
Yeah,
but I just want to hold out that possibility.
True. Yeah, I suspect they're all true. I mean, I don't think they're doing this entirely for just because they're Republicans. I don't think that. I mean, the people who were joining the lawsuit initially, there was a cornucopia of people. So it wasn't just one or the other. It was both. Big tech is too powerful. And so you could be right. I think it's probably all of those things. Yeah, they're too powerful, and, we want to shake them up and so forth. We'll see. But personally, I approve.
All right, we'll see where it goes. I think that's at least part of what ultimately matters, according to the consequentialist field of ethical philosophy. Anyway, in our next headline, new rules for homeless residents in Oakland. The Oakland City Council passed controversial new rules Tuesday night that dictate where homeless residents can and can't camp and how they must camp. The policy makes certain areas near schools, homes, and businesses mostly off limits to encampments and lays out steps to move residents living there into housing or shelters and shut down the camps. After more than 100 community members weighed in, mostly in opposition, during a passionate public comment session that lasted for hours, the City Council then voted unanimously to approve the new policy. The move represents the city's first attempt to craft a set of sweeping rules to govern its unsheltered communities. It comes as camps that sprawl across sidewalks, parks, and vacant lots have pushed many Oaklanders to their breaking point. City officials are aware of 142 encampments throughout Oakland, about 70 of which have 3 or more residents, and many of which city staff says have become unsanitary and violent. That's, by my count, somewhere in the range of like 300, 400, something like that. It's about 70 of which have 3 or more residents, 142 encampments total. I'm going to guess somewhere around 300 people they're talking about there. So in terms of the wider homelessness epidemic, this is just one small piece of the nationwide problem that we're dealing with. But I just want to point out here, what seems to be happening is rich people in a sort of wider Bay Area don't like seeing or having to deal with homeless people, and so they're trying to sort of push them off of these informal encampments and into slightly more formal encampments. I don't know. Hopefully it's actually better. Hopefully it's good. A lot of this stuff, though, and this is something I've been wanting to learn more about for a while, so hopefully we can get a guest on to talk about it because it's deeply relevant. Doesn't a lot of this stuff have to do with like the Reagan administration's decision to open up mental health care facilities and push a bunch of people out into the streets effectively? Jamarl, you probably know what I'm talking about, right?
That's a good question. I'm not quite sure about that one. I mean, Reagan was atrocious in regards to the policies. This was kind of like the Reagan-Thatcher era where these guys were cutting regulation to the bone and whatnot and cutting taxes. But I'm not sure.
I think this might be specifically in California. I think this might have been specifically in California when he was governor of California.
Okay, and that I'm not sure of. That I'm not sure of. But I do want to point out, instead of just getting rid of the homeless, they shuffle them to somewhere else.
Yeah. Yes. And I think, that would not have been in the 80s. That I kind of credit myself. That would have been in the early 70s, most likely, late 60s, early 70s that happened. But yeah, I think that we should get somebody on to talk about that. I'm kind of chuckling. It's not exactly a chuckle-worthy topic, but we should definitely talk to somebody about that. Anyway, in our next headline, Breonna Taylor, The officer in the Breonna Taylor case for the first time has done an ABC News interview. The officer, Jonathan Mattingly, said he felt, quote, mostly frustration, end quote, as he watched months of protests across the country in reaction to Taylor's death. Mattingly, who fired his weapon 6 times the night that Taylor, a 26-year-old certified emergency medical technician, died in March, said, quote, there was so much misinformation out there, all these false narratives. This is not relatable to George Floyd. It's nothing like it. This is not a Ahmaud Arbery. It's nothing like it. It's not a race thing like people want to try to make it to be. This is the point where we're doing our job. We return fire. This is not us hunting somebody down, not kneeling on a neck. This is nothing like that. Again, this was an interview on ABC News by Michael Strahan. No resemblance to yours truly. I can't help but feel like this is going to inflame things even slightly more. What's your take, Jamarl?
Yes, but it's going to, anything that was going to be said was going to inflame things. Look, people are going to have qualms with this. He's going to say, yeah, it's not a race thing. That's easy for you to say. But at the end of the day, a woman is dead. Like, completely innocent, perfectly innocent, did nothing wrong, and dead from sleeping in her own home. So I understand that he feels pressure. I understand that he feels people are going after him and everything else, but context matters. He wants to say that these things are not the same. This is not him kneeling on a person's throat. Yes, the specific situation is different, but the outcome is the same. And, people look at this and they say, you burst through somebody's house and that woman is not even safe in her own bed. It may not be Floyd, but it does look problematic. And look, to be fair to him, maybe this is not a factor for him. Like, they went out to get a warrant, to burst into a place, and they opened fire. Who's responsible in that situation? Is it the cop that served the warrant? Is it the person who asked for the warrant and pushed through it? Is it the judge that gave it? It's systemically problematic in general, but who's specifically at fault? I understand where he comes from, but that's going to inflame it. Yeah, if that's what you're asking me.
Yeah, in a really broad, abstract sense, I will notice that there are two sort of interlocking mechanisms that drive polarization, specifically over news stories. And those two mechanisms are, one, that you have a slightly complicated set of events that's being reported on with some nuance where different sides can look at it and come to their own conclusions. And then two, what happens is the most controversial takes from each side get echoed by the other side. And so what most people hear on one side is the worst opinions on the other side, and the nuance sort of gets lost. And it's ugly. And I mean, that kind of thing has happened in this story, but I would just argue it happens in pretty much any news story that lasts for more than a day and gets a certain degree of the public's attention. Once it reaches a critical point, that set of phenomena is likely to come into effect. Anyway, in Kyrgyzstan, authorities on Wednesday set a new parliamentary election for December following a disputed vote that led to the resignation of the country's president. The October 4th parliamentary election was swept by pro-government parties, a result that the opposition dismissed as having been manipulated. Protesters took over government offices, prompting election authorities to nullify the results of the vote. Demonstrators also freed Sadir Zaporov, who was quickly named the new prime minister. Zaporov supporters threatened to from government buildings, forcing President Zurunbay Jeenbekov to step down on October 15th. Zaporov succeeded him as the acting head of state. And again, on Wednesday, that's today, by the way, the Central Election Commission set a new parliamentary election for December 20th. A presidential vote is expected in January. So we've just described in the last couple of weeks, a government remaking itself. I just want to point out how quickly these things can sometimes happen. And with that, I'm going to move on to our next headline. Rudy Giuliani talking about Hunter Biden here. Rudy Giuliani, in an appearance on Newsmax, disclosed a text message from Hunter Biden, a series of text messages actually, that purportedly show the son of the former vice president talking with underage girls while on crack, specifically a 14-year-old girl. Apparently he had nudes from her, and that's illegal. That's not just a little bit illegal, that's very illegal and wrong. He said that he had turned over the evidence to the Delaware State Police, Rudy Giuliani, that is. We'll see where that goes. This is just coming out last night. And last headline here, I want to make sure I get to this one. A NASA spacecraft briefly touched the surface of an asteroid, attempted to collect a sample of extraterrestrial rocks while there, and then successfully propelled itself away in a history-making mission on Tuesday. The OSIRIS-REx, that's an acronym for Origins, Spectral Interpretation, Resource Identification.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Yeah, Shane, that's amazing. That's pretty amazing. That's historic. And, you know, this gets this notion of us having the ability to go to
September 11th, 1999, second highest cumulative rating on the Palermo Technical Impact Hazard Scale. I think that was the thing, is that it had a pretty high rating of potentially impacting us. And so people were worried about it. Anyway, wrapping up here. Prior to Tuesday, only Japan had successfully obtained an asteroid sample. All preliminary information indicates the sample collection was a success. The NASA teams warned ahead of the event that it could take days to know for sure if the spacecraft obtained asteroid samples. That spacecraft is expected to remain in Venu's orbit until 2021, when it will begin its journey home, landing back on Earth with the sample sometime in 2023. And with that,
you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
And back in a minute.
Fault lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you live out of our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share this video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Definitely call in. So let's start off with somewhat of a weird way of hitting this topic, but a typical Hegelian dialectic, master and slave relationship, or for that matter, serf and employee. Serf and lord, or let's say lord and serf, or for that matter, employer, employee. Yes, one is clearly in charge in the situation, the master, or for that matter, the employer. By the same token, the employer can't necessarily do the job of the employee. Just like the master couldn't necessarily do the job of the slave, and because of such, in a weird, odd way, get mastered in and of itself. Now, this is uncomfortable for somebody who's in a boss position to not be able to entirely control the mechanism of what they need and the way they make their profit and the way they feed themselves. But fear not, there's a solution to this: technology. Thanos's glove. Technology allows you, if your employees get uppity and say, start calling for things like food and medicine and lights, and they go out saying, we want $15 an hour. This is what we want. The fry cooks, the people who are doing service work. We want this. We want this. When you realize that you can save a nickel and you can teach them a lesson at the same time. You put in a robot. And not just put in a robot. That robot flips burgers. That robot does everything that that particular employee was going to do, and you get rid of that employee. In fact, as you've noticed, if you're in other countries, in many places, they have those checkout counters that are already there in those various food places where you can go to the robot to get you familiar with doing that service without interacting with a human being. Those human beings would get less and less, and those robots will proliferate more. I only have to pay that robot once. I have to pay that human being constantly. That human being gets blue. That human beings have feelings. That human being gets sick. That human being is cranky at times in the way that it engages customers. I want to have full control over it, and I can save a nickel doing it. So yeah, that person is gone. If you've noticed, when you go into the grocery stores, you see checkout counters that are now automated. Even if you're in CVS, you see the checkout counters that are automated. At a certain point, especially after COVID, you may not even have that store there anymore. Where are Tower Records? They don't exist because you can get those things easier online. I'm making the point that retail is going the way of the dinosaur. COVID only sped up the process. And many of those workers who are working at those stores, many of those people who are pushing for the additional wages, that robot will be doing that job. Not just retail, even things like Uber or 7-Eleven. You walk in, you walk out, you hit your credit card, bam. This doesn't necessarily deal with what happens to the employees, the people, the human beings who are in that situation. This just is a boon of wealth for the people at the top and the bosses. Employees need to know this, that the further it goes on through time, the weaker you get just because of automation and technology. And at some point, you need to be able to control the reins of your space. You need to be able to pull the reins. And your device of the general strike or the withholding labor, that gets weaker the more your society gets automated, and that automation is controlled by 1%. Now, same thing or something similar happens politically. You have a Democratic Party that is entirely dependent upon the left to get in office. The left and blacks. This is supposedly their base. You don't like your base. In fact, your policy positions are antagonistic to your base, even though you may take a policy thing where you may say one thing and do a dog and pony show. At the end of the day, you don't like your base. And in 2020, that base got uppity, just like those employees who wanted to eat. And that base tried to run away with it. So much so, an oligarch comes from behind the shadows, jumps into the race, and tries to pull it in his direction because he's terrified that a socialist was going to take it. Once Joe Biden was going to win it, he was okay with that because they're of like minds. What's interesting here is that there's documents that are coming out showing what Joe Biden is thinking about, and you've seen him on a debate stage popping the left. I beat the socialists. Or for that matter, I veto Medicare for all if it got over the finish line, despite, the majority of the public backing it. Or, no, I'm not for the Green New Deal. Or we're for fracking and all of this other stuff that he's been going on with. Donald Trump did get him to do it, but that didn't necessarily matter because I've described that the left is a broken lot. They've been that way for the last 40 years. When you get a policy that has 88% support in the context of a party, and you still bend down, bend the knee, then you're irrelevant. Here's the catch. In the same way that those workers get weaker over time, the Democratic Party is also uneasy with the fact that those lefties was getting belligerent, is also uneasy that those lefties may take a different tact in going forward, especially since of the way 2020 looked like it was going to peter out, and are looking for ways to mitigate that. You saw that by them having the Republicans on the stage walking across the DNC convention, and you also see it with this new report out from Politico that says Joe Biden is vetting GOP candidates for cabinet positions. Now, you could say this is just him doing theatrics for unity, or you could come to the honest conclusion that no, the reality of it is that these guys are more in line with Republican parties and more comfortable with Republican parties. A Republican standing beside Joe Biden at the very least makes him look like a Democrat, as opposed to that Joe Biden standing beside, let's say, a Sanders, which just makes Joe Biden look pointless. Which is the catch. The left, for the most part, is a broken lot, but how long is that lot going to remain broken? And if you have policies that are more in line with, let's say, a Romney Republican or a Bush Republican, then maybe you need to bring some of those guys into your fold in order to mitigate this other group. Either the DNC stage or, for that matter, the eyeing the candidates for the slots. This is not just a unity pitch. This is a pitch for them to maintain their level of authority and maintain their level of power in the party by appropriating others to mitigate a bunch that they've gotten to the point where they can't necessarily depend on. This is, again, what I'm considering the left. It is a beaten, captured lot. And the idea that you would have any level of pride, any level of credibility, any level of ego, any level of backbone, and you will allow not just the candidate to slap people who you give huge amounts of credibility to, like AOC or whatnot, but to also mitigate you in this way, to put you to the corner in this way. You are infinitely necessary to win, and yet, listen to the least. Irrelevant in a political space. And I'm making the point to you that until you get to the point of saying, I am done, and utilizing political strength, utilizing political leverage on the space, the stick to which you have at your disposal, meaning I might not be able to win, but I can surely make you lose, and you would either acquiesce to my demands or fail. Until you get there, which I suspect they are concerned about, hence this, nothing changes. Shane, the newest indignity. Joe Biden is bringing in Republicans into his cabinet, apparently. What say you?
The DNC must be destroyed. DNC delenda est. There's no, I don't know what else to say, man. You're talking about a party hierarchy there. You're talking about an organized group with self-serving interests, the same way that a corporation or a government in broad sense functions. And that's the political representation for people on the left. I'm not on the left, but I'm not on the right. I don't really have representation. It seems like you, at one point, did, or at least thought you did. And if you don't like what they're doing and you don't like that they're bringing in people from the other side, that they have no clear policy agenda, then figure out a way to destroy them. And at the same time, and hopefully beforehand, or hopefully at least you have this part figured out once you've figured out how to destroy them too. Hopefully you have something really good to replace them, something way, way better, and some means to keep them from reverting into the stagnation and the same political delinquency that the DNC has fallen into. But just to put it in terms that stark, the DNC must be destroyed.
See,
what's your take, Jamarl?
The thing is, no, I agree with you on this. I mean, I'm reading, this article is hilarious. There was another article that came out that said that the lefties, like the progressives in Congress, sent a strongly worded letter to Joe Biden, getting across that they don't like some of his choices or whatever. It's like, are you serious? He doesn't care about you. Like, at the end of the day, if we're talking about support, no, I at one point I probably had a false consciousness thinking that this was the people who were backing. But keep in mind, I've made the point before, blacks reflexively vote Democrat. Reflexively do so. And from my own experiences, it's not even one of those things where you even need to know who the candidates are. You just typically make that vote. I'm saying that needs to change. And that very specific act of reflexively voting for Democrat in that way destroys your ability to have any kind of political influence. It kills it. Because at that point, your vote is a captured lot. The same thing is true for the left. Listen to this part. This part is great. They were talking about this notion of these guys working in tandem, but that tradition died. It says, my primary concern is involved with people in the cabinet who push back against corporate power and who support massive economic stimulus and broad provisions for healthcare. David Siegel, the executive director of Demand Progress, a liberal advocacy group. Unfortunately, there are no prominent Republicans that I know of that are on board for that agenda. Well, there are no prominent Democrats either. There are no prominent Democrats that I know of either. So yes, Shane, I would like for that to get destroyed. I would like for that to change. Let me ask you this. Even if you did get that party to self-emulate, if there's only two parties, do you end up in the same situation?
That's a good question. I mean, I think you probably would be likely to, but that's holding everything else equal. And frankly, if you manage to change that, then not everything else will stay equal. So, ceteris paribus, but everything, if everything else holds, assuming everything else holds, then yeah, that would revert. But frankly, if you change a lot of stuff, if you do pretty comprehensive reforms of your political system up and down, piecewise, as it were, changing one thing at a time. I mean, again, we were talking about experimental approaches to governance. I don't want to go too nilly-willy here, too wild here, but if you incrementally have a government that can effectively experiment on itself and make useful changes to its operating system, so to speak, then over time, the assumption here is that over time, if you have the right people managing the system, if you have the combination of brilliant ingenuity and responsible wisdom, something like that, and ethics undergirding it all, then you're going to get a better society in the long run. So I'm kind of pivoting off of your question because you asked about, if you have another duopoly, is that duopoly going to be the same in form and function as this one? And the answer is probably yes, but, we should aim to change all that stuff. We should aim to update. These are centuries old ways of doing governance. Anyway, Jamarl, we've got to go into a break. We're going to come back on the other side of this break, talking about the OPCW, the former OPCW chief, Bustani, defending whistleblowers on false flag attacks in Syria, defending folks and being blocked from the UN about it. We're back with Piers Robinson on the other side. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Yo! So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the...
No, Piers?
By any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show, By Any Means Necessary, daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're joined by our guest, Piers Robinson. He is the pardon me. I thought we had Piers on. Well, in that case.
Yeah, he's coming up.
I heard him come on. Yeah. I heard over my ear a little conversation going on. At least I thought I did.
No worries.
We're going to have him on to be talking about the OPCW and Jose Bustani. And I just want to give props again. This came out a couple of days ago. Aaron Mate on YouTube. You can go check this out for yourself. Aaron Mate interviewed Jose Bustani. They also posted this over on thegrayzone.com. But the title of the video, if you want to watch this, it's about an hour, a little bit under an hour and a half, well over an hour. Title of the video is Ex-OPCW Chief Defends Syria Whistleblowers and Reveals He Was Spied On Before Iraq War. Again, good interview. I've been watching pieces of this over the last couple of days. I haven't sat down to watch the whole thing yet. But good interview. And again, props to Aaron Mate. Really would love to talk with that dude on this show, get his take. And if we can, it'd be great to talk to Jose Bustani too. But I'd understand if he wants to maintain his impartiality. He might be a little bit cautious about that. Jamarl, what's your take?
It would be good. Aaron Mate is extraordinarily good at what he does. And so, yeah, he would be amazing to talk to on Fault Lines. I've had him on my show once going into, I forget what we're going into. I think it was the Russiagate stuff. But people need to realize how disturbing this is. The OPCW is supposed to be an impartial tool. It's supposed to be an instrument that goes in to determine whether or not chemical weapons have been used. It is supposed to be impartial, and it's not to be used as a weapon, as a hammer to bang over people who you don't particularly like. In this very specific instance, a report comes out that tries to implicate Syria in a chemical weapons strike. This leads to basically attacks on the country. Now, the catch is information started to get leaked showing that, well, wait a minute, these things weren't dropped. This looked like it was placed. Or you realize, well, wait a minute, the terrorists also have access to weapons. I mean, the New York Times did a report with this stuff coming out of Turkey. And you had a backup to the leak, meaning the whistleblower who came out and released the documents, that person was backed up by another leak. And now you have Jose Bustani coming out basically saying, yeah, what those people, the leaks were correct. You even have intimidation, where the people were being intimidated to try to push the story in a very specific direction. So this story is extremely disturbing, and it brings into question the OPCW in and of itself as an impartial actor, and whether it's ever been an impartial actor at this point, right? The moment that you find it once. So, Aaron Matei, this was a great story, and this was a great reveal. And it is even more revealing that the mainstream media did not pick this up. Like, at no point in this process did the mainstream media pick this up. That's profound. And that gives you a crack in the door, if that makes sense. This is one of those things where it's like the rationality of it, or the break in rationality in regards to what you would consider to be rational, reveals a little bit more about reality to you. In this case, you have... It's
like the thin edge of a certain wedge.
Yeah.
It gives you that. It gives you the first hint that there's something weird going on. If you find out about this story, I know you're going to continue. I'll hand it back over to you. If you find out about this side of the story, you're like, wait, the dude who headed the organization seems like a responsible guy. He was blocked from the UN. He wasn't allowed to talk to the UN about concerns that he had that whistleblowers in an organization that he formerly ran were being suppressed to suit the political interests. And I haven't heard about this. Why haven't I heard about this? This seems like a significant deal, because for a lot of people, if you've been following this stuff even peripherally, you know that the chemical weapons thing was basically used by the Obama administration as the pretext for getting more involved in Syria. That was the red line. And, that's the phrase that a lot of people hear is Obama saying chemical weapons are a red line. I'm paraphrasing there. Anyway, Jamarl, you were talking.
No, I was mainly finished. I mean, I was just basically echoing that it's a massive deal. Like, and yes, it's the crack in the door, or the seam letting you know there's something else. In a rational society, with a rational media, where that media job, where it wanted to explain to the public information that it needed to know to give it an understanding and a way to frame and contextualize its world. You have an organization that is supposed to be there entirely, nonpartisan. It's not there for the politics of it. We are here to do a very specific job. Our job is to go and test for chemical weapons. And you find out that one of the nations is using that device that's supposed to be nonpartisan, completely impartial, for political gain. Now, so much so that this justified attacks. So at that point, you're like, wait a minute. A president attacked a country over something that was dodgy. And more importantly, it seems that the country itself was pushing that organization to put out that dodgy information. Why is that not a story? Like, how is that not a story? I mean, that's juicy on so many levels. Yeah. On the OPCW being influenced, on the push from the government, from the attacks, all of that stuff becomes a juicy story. And yet none of it seems to be of worth to be on the mainstream on news. It's so bizarre. Even in the context of a presidential election, you would think that would be a big story. And yet, not. Why do you think it's not? Answer me that. That's the interesting question, right?
Well, but I mean, anybody who's following what you're saying, they know exactly what I'm going to say. At least they have their own idea of it. It's not because there's political bias up and down, in and out throughout the whole system. I guess, another angle in on this is you have the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So this is a sort of administrative tool and administrative body, again, responsible for helping to sort of diagnose in order to prohibit the use of chemical weapons, in military engagements, whatever, just chemical weapons in general. And then you get this fast forward a couple of decades, you get this same organization apparently covering up the use of chemical weapons by certain groups, basically mispainting who's doing it. Well, if you're going to, I'm just going to point out two points I could make here. I'll start with the second one. If you're going to cover up the use of chemical weapons, if you're going to say that it was done by party B when really it was party A or vice versa, what you're actually doing now is you're not just muddying the waters. In some sense, you're not just delegitimizing yourself as an organization. In some sense, you are making it more likely in the long run that chemical weapons will be used. Because if people see chemical weapons being used, and they, if Assad isn't using, I'm not saying that he actually did this stuff, but if Assad sees terrorists using chemical weapons, sees rebels using chemical weapons, and then he's getting blamed for it, then it's like if those tools are available to him, and if people are going to blame him for using them, whether or not he did, assuming he didn't, then in some sense, it kind of makes sense for him to use them. And I'm not saying that he actually did that, but the point here is if you're falsely accusing somebody of using a gun, it gets a little bit weird here, but I think that you're just going to increase the rate of gun violence in general. It's like you're creating a sort of black market informationally for how this stuff gets done. That's point two. Point one here is, if you're creating, OPCW created to, help discourage and prohibit the use of chemical weapons, the organization itself, as it gets steered in the wrong direction, as it becomes non-neutral, as it becomes used as a political tool, the organization itself, this just happens. This happens all over the place. And how did it happen? It probably didn't happen. I mean, sure, there are people in governments around the world, I'm sure, who've tried to influence it over the years. But I think we need some new definition, some new institutional understanding of what real independence means, because probably what this looked like was like think tanks coming in from the outside who are ostensibly neutral, but were themselves actually tied by multiple connections through, other institutions to governments. In other words, you have this sort of sleight of hand with influence that takes place, where an ostensibly independent organization is nevertheless swallowed up and subsumed by political interests, because those political interests tend to pervade the system when they don't have a direct outlet. You see what I'm saying there? It's a kind of weird and subtle point, but the idea is, if you want neutrality, and if your only definition of neutrality is government A can't influence organization B, but nevertheless government A can still, bring in politicians who, after they're out of their tenure, go to work at a think tank that then influences organization B, you're not going to get rid of the bias. You're just going to hide it. You're just going to diffuse it throughout the system imperceptibly, and in the process, build up what some people would call a deep state or a persistent state and its auxiliaries. You build up this whole network of forces that are increasingly out of your control. And in the process of trying to bring, specific organizations under sort of greater standards of objectivity, under greater levels of scrutiny, in the process, you actually make the whole thing a lot murkier. You see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I think I do see what you're saying. I mean, basically, if George Bush...
And we don't have, assuming that's true, and I'm pretty damn sure that's true, we don't really have a way to understand or prevent that process.
Basically, to try to create
an really don't
entity. Well, I would say if George Bush...
And what happens if you don't have an independent entity? Then the whole world gets pervaded by it. Anyway, go ahead, Jamarl.
Well, I was just going to say, if George Bush is president, he leaves from the president and goes to work at, some independent entity, organization, then right off the bat, it's not independent anymore, because Bush is going to be looking out for his own interests and tacitly the interests of whatever, government is in office. Like, if we're dumping a bunch of money into an organization, by definition, an organization is not going to be independent. I think that's your point. And so how do you have an independent organization in that context that needs to operate, but needs an operating budget and all of this other stuff, and yet be separate and distinct from these other factors to just do a job? This case was even worse. And there are 2 points to this, just to back up what you're saying. It incentivizes it also, meaning from the standpoint of chemical weapons, just through this notion of having false flags. Like, if the public or the world is going to say Syria did X because the United States accused them of doing it. Now, that's a bit rich and a bit on the nose considering the Iraq stuff, but fair enough. And you find out that the OPCW was used as a political instrument. And you find out that not only did it work, that because of your allies, that basically you were able to blame another government for it, then don't you incentivize false flags in that context? Meaning, the moment that you can, and granted, this is going to depend on environmental factors of the governments that you're dealing with or the people who you're in these kind of political jockeying matches with. But I do agree with you that it does seem to incentivize that stuff. Also, this never really made sense. Assad had, like 90% of his territory back. And everybody understood that the chemical weapons was a pretext that the U.S. was using to get more involved in Syria. Everybody understood it. Yeah. Assad, after clinging to power, like grim death, for all of that time in the face of Western aggression, like naked Western aggression, he's all of a sudden going to use chemical weapons when he doesn't need to use chemical weapons. And you ask, why did he do that? And they say he's a bad guy. And it's like, so him being a bad guy means he's stupid?
Out of control. He's a runaway strongman leader, something like that. Yeah, he's a wild man or whatever. And then they'll switch back. And you see this particularly with Russia. We've got to go into a break. You'll see this with accusations against Vladimir Putin. They'll switch between saying he's like an out-of-control strongman, wild leader, and then he's a devious, sly manipulator of the American presidential election. So sly, in fact, that we still haven't determined exactly how he influenced our election. It doesn't make sense. The contradictions, if you don't notice them, if all you're hearing is bad man is bad, then that's where your mind is sort of left to wander and spin. But once you start to notice the contradictions, I think that's one way into the truth here, as you start to ask what's actually going on. Anyway, we'll go into a break. We'll be back on the other side. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment, Stephen Lendman. He's an author and a geopolitical analyst, and you can read his articles at his website. That is stephenlendman.org. And that, by the way, Stephen spelled with a PH. So StephenLendman.org. Stephen, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine. Good, doing pretty well. Have an appointment. I'm on Central Time, and you're on Eastern Time. This morning, sometimes this morning included, when I get called, I hear a time that you want me on, and I think it's a time that I cannot come on. But I can come on if it's in Central Time, and you're talking Eastern Time. Well, that happened this morning. Anyway, here I am.
That's great. We're very glad to have you. And by the way, Jamarl is on Eastern Time. I'm a lunatic. I am on Pacific Time, which means I get up every morning at around 2:33 in the morning, something like that. Still struggling to get used to that. In any event, much ado about nothing there. I wanted to talk with you. You have a couple of stories over on your website. I'll start with this one. Our title of the article here is Phony U.S. Charges of Russian Cyber Attacks. That's, again, an article you can find over at stephenlendman.org. In that article, you're talking about new charges that came out on Monday from the Justice Department, alleging the following. Basically, 6 Russian military intelligence officers were charged with deployment of destructive malware and other disruptive actions in cyberspace. Apparently, I mean, I guess this seems to be the sort of continuum. Just starting here, you have the fall of the Soviet Union. There's this long, obviously the Cold War, long-term intelligence battle between the United States and the Soviets. And then pretty soon the internet gets born. And you have all of these like suspicious rumors in the US of like Russian hackers. And this is decades ago at this point. I'm not talking about 2016 quite yet. Just talking about this general attitude in the US where people are like wary of the Russians. Again, just a continuation of the same Cold War antagonistic mentality. And then things accelerate a bit, particularly in 2016, when suddenly Russian hacking is all that anybody's talking about. And then for years since then, there have been accusations, baseless accusations, I'm going to add, repeated baseless accusations of Russian hacking, where basically we will accuse people of doing things, whether they're Russian nationals or people who are associated with Russians in some way, or they're part of the Russian government even. Some of them are, but most aren't. It's sort of like we're just using the words Russian and hacking together because it has a sort of, there's an association built into it. Anyway, these new charges came out on Monday. I'm just going to lead it like this. Stephen, what do you think about this?
Well, it's the same old story. There's a common denominator that defines all U.S. charges against Russia. There's never any evidence presented that proves anything. They can charge anything they want, and they do repeatedly. The most obvious to most people is a Russian-U.S. election interference, which, of course, never happened. And again, there was no evidence presented, not by the U.S. intelligence community, not by the Mueller probe, not by the separate individual House and Senate probes, not any evidence whatsoever proving the charges. And this happens with everything else, the downing of the Malaysian airliner, the Skripal affair in Great Britain, just goes on and on, paying off the Taliban to kill U.S. forces, either attacking or threatening, cyber attacking, I guess, the U.S. power grill, or threatening a power grid, or threatening to attack it. Never any evidence presented. With no evidence, the charges are groundless. And I must say that since the 1917 Russian Revolution, they got rid of the Tsarist dictatorship. The U.S. has been the U.S.-led West has been antagonistic toward Russia because it has a different political and economic system, mostly the latter over the former. It's a different system. It's not because Russia, or Soviet Russia, or today's Russian Federation threatens the U.S. There's never really been any threat. If there ever was a time of any threat, it might have been under Joseph Stalin. Well, he died in 1954, I believe. I think I have the year right. I mean, that was ages ago. 66 years ago. I mean, there's no threat at all. The difference, the reason today, where earlier it was a different economic system, mainly an economic system. Today the economic systems are rather similar, not identical, but rather similar. The threat today is, or the alleged threat today, is that Russia's development poses a threat to the U.S. drive for hegemony. It's especially true in U.S. relations with China. China indeed is a growing, very dominant economic power that will supplant the U.S. as the dominant economic power in the world, and that drives people in Washington crazy. So they invent threats against these countries that don't exist. Well, Russia isn't at war with anybody. It's helping Syria combat U.S.-supported terrorists. That's what it's doing. It's not at war with anybody. China is at war with nobody. The U.S. is at war with everybody, either by hot or other means, and this stuff never ends.
Stephen, we're at war with everybody because we're holding the world up on, on our shoulders. That's, it's our burden. I'm totally tongue-in-cheek on that one. Yeah, I agree with you. This is policy, though, right? I mean, the thing that puts us at odds with all of these countries is specifically policy, and that's Democratic or Republican administrations. Mainly, we want domination. And that domination, if we don't have it, we use whatever dogs of war at our disposal, whether that's propaganda, in which case you have like here we're going to put charges out, but we're not really going to give much detail on those charges. We're just going to let those charges sit out there. This seems to be just the playbook in regards to the way we handle affairs of other nations, especially nations that are not our allies. Do you remember when the Tillerson memo came out, when Rex Tillerson first came in? And Tillerson was given this memo that was very blunt and very specific that basically said we work with countries that are in our interests, and countries that are not, we attack those countries. And you want to have more friends than enemies. That the memo was very straightforward, and very, very pragmatic in regards to the way it went about talking about, people who weren't allies. Can you explain that specific dynamic? Meaning, in the way that you're talking about China and Russia now, basically saying they're not within our sphere of influence, and because they're not, they're open for attack. And how that policy basically was developed after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Well, that's exactly right. George Kennan was the father of U.S. containment of Russia, and I've written about him a number of times over the years. And it's a different system, but it's a different country. The U.S. has hegemonic aims, and the U.S. won't let anybody interfere with its pursuit of these aims. When Tillerson or anybody else talks about U.S. interests, what they're really saying is they demand that other countries sacrifice their sovereign rights by bending to U.S. interests. So, obey U.S. demands, even if it harms your own internal interests. That's what the U.S. wants. It's really the political side of countries are very secondary to the economic and the strategic and so on. So the U.S. can ally itself with some of the world's most despotic regimes. Good Lord, Saudi Arabia stands out maybe as the most obvious example because the Saudis and the U.S. Get along together, and the Saudis bend to the U.S. will, and so on and so forth. And it buys U.S. weapons, and the U.S. buys Saudi oil. A symbiotic relationship. Sisi in Egypt, another ruthless despot, but he's and to use the term "our," meaning the U.S., he's our guy in Egypt. Franklin Roosevelt talked about our SOBs in Central America, Nicaragua, places like that, way back in the 1930s. They were bad guys, but they were our bad guys. That's the way the U.S. operates. But countries that are sovereign and independent and pursue their own national interests, which every country should, and don't bend to the U.S. at the expense of their own interests, they become bad guys on the U.S. target list for regime change, and the U.S. goes at them by hot wars in too many cases, and what I call wars by other means, mainly sanctions and stuff like that. And of course, sanctions are illegal unless ordered by the Security Council, never by individual countries against any other. But this is a prime weapon the U.S. uses, and it almost never works. Almost never works, and it's used over and over again. Never got Cuba or Iran or Russia or China or Venezuela or Syria or any of these countries to bend to the U.S. will. You would think what fails time and again for decades would be dropped in favor of another policy. Nope, the U.S. keeps doing the same thing over again. Isn't that a definition of insanity?
It's sort of like putting fingers in a dike, but there are increasingly many holes in the dike. In other words, if you try to sanction a country, there are a bunch of opportunities for other countries to either continue to sell it to them or to support them, which many countries would want to, in order to oppose, America and what America is doing around the world. So again, it's like water's leaking through the dike. We keep trying to put our fingers in it. We're running out of fingers, and it's not going to end well. Stephen, we've only got a minute or two left here, but what's your take? And why do you think that we have relied so heavily on sanctions, economic sanctions, over the years?
Well, I guess the U.S. is so used to doing it for so long, it just keeps doing it, thinking it'll make the people of targeted countries suffer, so they'll want their government to change to ease their suffering. It usually turns out just the opposite. When countries are attacked this way, wars by other means, people can only rely on their government for protection, so they lean on their government. They don't oppose the government. This happens time and again. Oh, it's terrible. The U.S. is a declining empire. It's a multipolar world. Unipolarity is really going into the dustbin of history very fast. The U.S. one day will wake up to this, probably when it's too late.
Well, let's end it with this one because we have about 2 minutes. Actually, we have about 1 minute or 30. Let's end it with this one. Stephen, I want to thank you for coming on. Where can people find your content?
Well, my website is Stephen Lendman, StephenLendman.org, and I'm putting up new articles now.
You are a hardworking man.
Many of them, by the way.
Yeah, you're a hardworking man.
He is a hardworking man, yet Stephen Lendman is resolute, resilient, and an inveterate fighter for the causes he cares about, many of which, of course, we care about too. And I'm just going to say this too. He's prolific. If you go over to his website, you'll see he does a bunch of work every morning, putting out a bunch of stuff every day. We love having you on, Stephen. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Oh, I appreciate coming on, guys. It's always great to be on with you.
All right. Have a good day, folks. Have a good day, Stephen. Hope the doctor's visit goes well. We're going to be taking a minute-long break here and back on the other side with headlines. Until then, you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political and institutional analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's go to the headlines. In the news, as of Tuesday, 8.2 million people in America have gotten COVID-19, and 220,800 people in America have now died from the virus. Tuesday night's World Series opener between LA Dodgers and Tampa Bay Rays had the lowest attendance since 1909. There were 11,388 attendees. Two new peer-reviewed studies, one being NYU Grossman School of Medicine, found that mortality has dropped among hospital patients by 18% since the pandemic began. At the start of the pandemic, patients had a 25.6% chance of dying. Now, that number has declined to 7.6. That is still a grim figure. Yesterday, the Justice Department sued Google for antitrust violations, alleging it abused its dominance in online search and advertising to stifle competition and to harm consumers. There are ongoing investigations to other major tech companies, including Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and both the Justice Department and Federal Trade Commission, by both entities, the Trade Commission. Google responded on Twitter by saying, today's lawsuit by the Department of Justice is deeply flawed. People use Google because they choose to, not because they're forced to or because they can't find alternatives. Shane, is that true? Are there alternatives to Google? In the report, they were talking about Google having like 90% market share based on some metrics. I know when I am on Google, there is no other where for me to go to make cash outside of Google from doing this particular task. And when people do a search, oftentimes they go to Google. And the thing is, it shapes your perspective of reality. Because if you're doing a search and the information comes back, there's a layer between that search and the information that you get back. And that layer is all the difference in the world, because that layer is going to shape and determine the reality of the person who's looking at the information. And so, Google has massive amounts of clout and power in our space. I remember, if I'm not mistaken, in 2016, I think Redacted Tonight, Lee Camp did this segment where he was showing if you put in like Hillary Clinton emails, it was giving you erroneous results. As opposed to, but if you went to like DuckDuckGo or one of the other search engines, it would give you the correct results. So no, Google has massive amounts of power. And this is specific to search. But like they mentioned, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, all of these companies have dramatic power. And the law just didn't keep up with the speed at which these companies were developed. I guess the catch is, and I would say this, what is the outcome? And what does it look like on the other side of it? Because I would make the point that the end result is the thing that matters more than anything else. And if you have an end result that breaks a search or breaks the way these companies operate to basically come up with a worse outcome, then that's just going to be horrible. So I think at the end of it, it depends on what does this look like at the end and what is the Justice Department trying to make this resemble. Does that make sense? Because you have to have an endpoint in mind, right? If you're saying that you guys are being anti-competitive, now I would say that it is all incentives in the world are to be that way. But you're being anti-competitive. Okay, so how do you want us to behave? And whatever way you want us to behave is a way that is going to cost us money. So what do you want this to look like? And I don't know what that is. Shane, does that make sense, Shane?
It does. I'm going to start with this. Have you noticed that Google's search engine actually kind of sucks these days? It's not actually that good of a search engine. I've noticed it. Maybe I'm imagining some halcyon days where Google was great and I could actually find what I wanted to find. But for a lot of stuff, I've got to search and then really think about my query and try it again 3 times if it's even slightly technical. And then I've got to go down to a couple pages in if I'm doing any kind of complicated searching there at all. I feel like it has genuinely gotten worse. I think that as people have learned how to play the SEO game, the search engine optimization game, the bad news has drowned out the good, the sort of Gresham's law of the media or advertising or something like that. Have you noticed that?
I mean, that does make sense. I mean, like you said, they get used to playing the SEO games. You have more content now. So, 10 years ago, compared to now, I would imagine the voluminous amount of data that people put out on themselves now as opposed to what it used to be in the old days. So I think all of it plays a part of it. It's because it's one thing when you're searching something 20 years ago. It's another thing when you're searching something today. You have all of these people with social media, all of these people writing articles. Any random spook could write an article attacking this or that. You even have newspapers that would have advertisements written as if they were articles. You have all of that stuff that takes place now. So yeah, it probably does suck more now. But that may not necessarily be a factor of the search engine.
I noticed that YouTube is better.
Say it again?
I mean, it's not like a thing against Google. YouTube's search engine, I am actually more likely to find useful information on YouTube than I am on Google, probably because it isn't gamed quite as much. And again, YouTube is also owned by Google, so this isn't like Google versus some other company. I'm just saying literally the search engine, the thing that brought them to popularity. Another side of this is, the word ecosystem comes to mind. We use where Google is really successful is because they have branched out and they've done the monopoly thing where they've, pervaded these different spheres of activity and have come to dominate not just that one thing, search, but a bunch of others too. Use Google Mail, use Google Docs, all this stuff. We use it together. People would call that an ecosystem. That's kind of a term that gets thrown around for that stuff. It is not an ecosystem. It is like a terrarium. It is a walled garden. It is a fortress within a fortress where they built it up.
It organizes your life.
Things are getting kind of stagnant.
It organizes your life. We would go in, we would use Google Docs, and then we would use Google Maps to get from point A to point B. And then Google will give you a heads up and say, hey, don't miss your flight. Your flight's going to leave in an hour. And it's how did you even know that? Because somehow it's reviewing your mail to, again, help you organize your life. And at some point, they're probably going to be the little Google thing where you can say, oh, that exists too, where you can say, hey, Google, cut on music. You think of Google Translator when I was in Poland and I was in that bar.
5 to 10 years ago.
It's
all that exciting stuff. I hear what you're saying. All this exciting stuff, the way that this stuff fits together, that's old at this point. Google has genuinely, and this is where the monopoly thing gets a little bit weird. They have not done that much exciting stuff in recent years. I can't think of any exciting things they have done.
I don't agree with. I mean, the automated car, the self-driving car.
That's not Google, mate. When I think of self-driving cars, I think of Tesla. I do not think of Google. I think of Tesla, Uber, and then maybe somewhere down the list, Google pops up. But
I see what you mean. But I guess my point is, but they're still doing those things. Google Maps is phenomenal as a service. I don't know. I disagree with that.
It's useful, but that's old.
Old?
It's
What do you
useful,
mean
but it's
by
old.
old?
Those are
Like,
incremental.
give me your definition of old.
Those are polishing the feces.
Oh, I see what you mean. So your definition of old is not something that is unusable or not something that is greatly valuable in your life. Your definition of old is basically
I'm not saying that those things don't work well. I'm just saying they haven't done new exciting things. Google at one point was doing a bunch of new exciting stuff, like every month practically, it seemed. And then at a certain point, it was every year. They were like releasing new stuff, and it was useful stuff. I can't remember real big recent innovations. I can't remember any. I think they've sort of gone dormant in some sense, research-wise, technologically. Anyway, we've got other headlines.
Yeah, we got other headlines.
Really
I disagree with that, though. It's like not knowing a specific thing that they're working on. I don't know how far you've looked into it to figure out what they were doing new. But fair enough. Fair enough. So let's go to the next one. Oakland City Council passed controversial new rules Tuesday night that dictates where homeless residents can and can't camp and how they must camp. The policy makes certain near schools, homes, and businesses mostly off limits to encampments and lays out steps to move residents living there into housing or shelters and to shut down the camps. After more than 100 community members weighed in, mostly in opposition, during a passionate public comment session that lasted hours, City Council voted unanimously to approve the new policy. The move represents the city's first attempt to craft a set of sweeping rules to govern its unsheltered communities. It comes as camps that sprawl across sidewalks, parks, and vacant lots have pushed many Oaklanders to the breaking point. City officials are aware of 142 encampments around Oakland, about 70 of which have 3 or more residents, and many of which staff says have become unsanitary and violent. That story may be one of the most aggravating stories that I've read today. In reading about the food banks that have proliferated, in reading about these kind of the homeless shelters. I remember I met a guy abroad who was talking about the number of homeless people that were in California that shocked him. He was like, oh my God, I didn't realize America had that many homeless people. Look, deal with the poverty. If China can come up with an anti-poverty program, I'm pretty sure that in this country, if we really did want to, we could do it, and we can make a mandate that said there's going to be nobody sleeping on the ground in America. That's not something that we allow. I'm sorry, that story is appalling. And it's like, let's shuffle them to somewhere else as opposed to just getting rid of homelessness. Let's go to the next one, just to get through them real quick. For the first time, the police officer injured in Breonna Taylor's shooting death is speaking out. He was interviewed by Michael Stranahan, no relation to my co-host here. The officer, Jonathan Matling.
Michael Strahan.
Strahan. Oh, I'm sorry. Strahan, not Stranahan. I'm sorry. Michael Strahan. The officer, Jonathan Mattingly, said he felt, quote unquote, mostly frustrated as he watched months of protests across the country in reaction to Taylor's death. Mattingly, who fired his weapon 6 times the night Taylor, a 26-year-old certified emergency medical technician, died in March, said, "There was so much misinformation out, all these false narratives. This is not relatable to George Floyd. It's nothing like it. It's not like Ahmaud Marbury. It's nothing like it. It's not a race thing like people want to try to make it to be. This is the point. We're doing our jobs. We were doing our jobs. We returned fire. This is not hunting somebody down, not kneeling on somebody's throat. This is nothing like that." You know, the thing I think that he doesn't entirely get, though, is whether or not you were doing your jobs. This was monstrously tragic. If something had happened like this, and these guys weren't cops, somebody would have went to jail. Basically, a no-knock warrant, busting through a door, you find out you didn't need to even be there, and yeah, you return fire, but you return fire after bursting through a door that many of the people on the scene, the majority of which say they had no idea that you even said anything. So I understand his angst and anger. If I was in a situation as an individual, I would feel that way too. But the larger context of this is, this went monstrously wrong. This does fit into a context in our system, Shane. I mean, you can see where he's coming from. By the same token, I don't know if it matters. I mean, am I thinking about this right? Like, or I know I'm thinking about this right, but how do you frame this? Let's say it that way.
I don't know if it matters too. I mean, it matters morally in terms of the dynamics of the story itself. Like, we're viewing it optically in terms of how it's going to affect the country. But, you know, she died. if they're guilty of something, they should be charged with it. They shouldn't be charged with, not charged. They shouldn't be put in jail for something that they were not guilty of. But if they're guilty of doing something, and it seems like that they were, then they should be put in jail.
Yeah,
they should face, they should be sentenced for
system.
that. I mean, I'm stumbling over myself a little bit, but that's ultimately where it matters most locally. And it's weird that we've blown it up into this national story, but I guess those are just how these things work. You take these small stories that become emblematic of some wider divide, and then political folks, political operatives, whatever, make a very big deal out of it to try to drive for change in society, for better and for worse.
Okay, hey, fair enough. Russia's foreign minister called for collective efforts Tuesday to prevent a large-scale war in the Persian Gulf and got strong support from the Security Council members except the United States, which called Iran the major culprit and urged it to be held accountable for supporting terrorists and destabilizing the region. Sergei Lavrov, the hardest working man on the planet, told a high-level virtual council meeting that the worst-case scenario was avoided earlier this year following the U.S. killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani, and warned that the situation remains fragile and can become dangerous and unpredictable again. Russia, which holds the Council's presidency this month, believes that if we work together openly and impartially, if we pool our political will and our creative potential, we will be able to help the states of the Persian Gulf overcome this difficult historic period and create an effective system of collective security, he said. Robert Malley, president of Brussels-based International Crisis Group, warned that the regional-wide conflict now looms largest across the globe is a conflict nobody apparently wants, a conflict triggered by tensions in the Gulf region, quote, unquote. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's do this. Let's take a break. We will be back in a moment, in probably 30 seconds. Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Ariel Gold, National Co-Director at CodeBank. Ariel, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, I think about as anxious and stressed as the rest of America, if not the world, as we count down to this election and watch the COVID numbers go up and so much else.
That is, I think, where a lot of people are these days. It's been a while since we've had you on. How have you been doing? You've been coping with COVID, or what's going on?
Yeah, well, I'm doing great. I'm in upstate New York and here with my kids, and yeah, just waiting to see what's going to happen in this election.
Yeah, like as are many of us. Good to hear you're doing well. Glad to hear you're spending time with kids. All right, thank you again for being with us. We brought you on to talk about a couple of things, but let's just start here. The United States is being trumpeted in our media, specifically the Trump administration, a little bit muted, but they're being trumpeted for helping to sign these deals between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. So the deals have been signed in the last couple of weeks, and then folks went out from Israel, flew out to the UAE. That was on Sunday, and then to Bahrain on Tuesday. I wanted to get your take. I know that you have some opinions here. What do you think? What do you think about these deals, Ariel?
Well, first of all, these deals are a sham and an embarrassment to even the word peace. What the deal with the UAE is really about is U.S. weapons sales. Part of the deal is that the UAE will get to purchase billions of dollars in U.S. weapons, which will include the notorious and coveted F-35 fighter jet, and I should say notorious for flying over Gaza and dropping bombs on a captive population. And in exchange for these weapons sales and in exchange for a nice pat on the back from the U.S., the largest participant in global militarism, they are putting their stamp on Israeli apartheid. Now, for Palestinians, it's really nothing new. The Gulf states have been throwing Palestinians under the bus for a while now, and cooperation between states like the UAE as well as Saudi Arabia and Israel have been going on for a while now. Because now they're going to take place in the open, and there's likely to be a new development in the next couple days. It could be as early as today, which is that Sudan, in exchange for being taken off the U.S. terror list, which could have been a good thing, will be normalizing with Israel as well. What this really reeks of, all of these deals, is desperation. Desperation by Donald Trump to try to do anything to get more evangelical Christians to vote for him. Desperation by Netanyahu, who for months now has had thousands, tens of thousands of people outside his home protesting, demanding that he resign, and desperation from leaders like MBZ of the UAE, who are looking to distract attention from the war crimes they have been involved in Yemen.
Let me ask you this. With all of these countries coming together, I guess were these countries working behind the scenes anyway? Meaning, Saudi Arabia and Israel, of course, but the UAE, Bahrain, the countries that are basically being joined in this kind of peace agreement, were they working behind the scenes anyway? Meaning, is this a thing of class interests where the people who are at the top basically are interacting with a country who they believe that it will be a successful fiduciary relationship for them? And is there a militaristic component to this also in regards to creating a bloc against Iranian influence in the region?
Absolutely. And there's joint interest in terms of, again, weapons sales. Israel, for anybody who didn't know, is the largest exporter of weaponized and surveillance drones in the world. And the UAE and Israel had already been cooperating on weapons. And now, in fact, Israeli weapons companies will be going to a big weapons expo in the UAE. So absolutely, this has been happening because those who commit war crimes in Yemen and those who commit war crimes in Gaza have so much in common.
Well, with the weapons that they're selling there, though, it's wild. We greenlit that Yemen war. Basically, we gave Saudi Arabia the green light for that war in order so they wouldn't intrude upon the plans dealing with the JCPOA. And that war has dragged on for all of these years. Is there any energy at all into stopping that war? It seems like the war continues to drag on in the background, and all energy that seemed to be there at one point seemed to have dried up. What is the latest going on in that conflict?
I wouldn't say it has dried up, the energy to end that war, and I would say that the end to that war is in our sight. Of course, we should say that U.S. Congress has the appetite to end that war. They've passed a war powers resolution, which unfortunately Trump vetoed. But I think we're going to see another war powers resolution going through Congress, and either having veto-proof numbers, or if we have a different administration in, getting a signature from the president. The UAE has, in fact, pulled out officially from the war in Yemen because it was damaging its image, among other things. They're still very much involved behind the scenes, covertly, in terms of arming groups on the ground, but they have officially pulled out. And I would say that Saudi Arabia is looking for an exit from this brutal war, and it cannot happen too soon, because Yemen, which was already the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, has now been hit with coronavirus. And the last time I looked at the numbers, they had a 25% fatality rate from COVID. That is because of malnutrition and cholera. That is because of a lack of hospitals and supplies. Just a dire humanitarian crisis. So an end to this war cannot come too soon.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that, is it just COVID? Why do you think that not only the UAE, but now Saudi Arabia appears to be looking to pull out? Ariel?
Well, Saudi Arabia has its own internal problems, a lot brought on by COVID, as well as other things, but their economy is tanking. And Mohammed bin Salman, the bonesaw murderer, does not have high popularity. I think he got into this war like we got into the Iraq war or the Afghanistan war, thinking, oh, this will be a quick, tidy little war. And it has not been a quick, tidy little war. And I think the Saudi people would like to see that end. And there's enormous international pressure. So after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, we saw talent agencies, we saw investments, we saw so many people pulling out of Saudi Arabia, canceling events and more. And so, it's been a stain on Saudi Arabia. And now the Yemen war is also a stain on Saudi Arabia with international backlash against it. And I think Mohammed bin Salman, like Donald Trump, he would like to be popular, even though, of course, Saudi Arabia is no type of democracy at all. It's an absolute monarchy. But still, he would like his people to adore him, and he would like the world to adore him. He put so much energy into branding Saudi Arabia and branding himself as this reformer, this moderate, this modern dictator, but a modernizer. And the war in Yemen is taking away from that.
Ariel, if Joe Biden wins, if Joe Biden gets in office, is he going to pull out of Yemen, pull the troops out of Afghanistan and Syria, and come up with a different foreign policy? Or basically, is this situation going to stay the same? I guess what I'm asking you is,
I think
is there going to be a difference? Or what do you expect in the foreign policy from a standpoint of differentiation if Biden gets in? And what do you expect if Trump remains in?
I think if Biden gets in, it's going to be very much up to us to push Biden. What he's told us so far is that he would really like to continue neoliberal policies. He'd really like to continue our Pentagon funding and so on. But there's an incredible progressive movement in America right now, in Congress and in the streets. And we do have the ability to push Biden.
How?
And I think
wait, Ariel, how do you have the ability to push Biden? How do you have the ability to push Biden?
Well,
what do you have as leverage to push Joe Biden? My contention is that you have zero leverage to push Biden.
Well, I think we have Congress to do that. So we have in 2016 and then again now in the primaries for 2020, we continue to put more progressives in Congress. And I think Biden will be responsive to them. But we will absolutely have our work cut out for us. And it's going to be an uphill fight. Now,
this is definitely, by the way, Ariel, this is one of those issues. We frequently have these conversations. We frequently go back and forth. We've had a couple of people last time. I think the time before last, we had Medea on, also from Code Pink, of course. We went back and forth on this. And I think Jamarl's argument, and I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm an independent. But I think Jamarl's argument on this is definitely, if you're not able to push him now, if that's where he is going into it, Congress seems to be pretty bellicose too. Congress seems to be by and large wanting more war. But, I kind of hear where you're coming from, and it is like an existential pitted race. And I understand there's a lot to dislike about Trump as well.
let's say I woke up on the optimist side of the bed today, and I could easily be on the other side. But I do think that we have some things, some signs that do give us hope. And I think we really need that hope right now. And one of the strongest signs of that, along with these progressives being elected to Congress, many of whom are anti-war, we have such things as the Yemen War Powers Resolution having passed through both chambers of Congress. We also have, we had for the first time real calls to cut the Pentagon budget. So we do have some tools at our disposal. And as I said before, of course, it's going to be an uphill battle. But the first thing that we have to do is get to that point, because if we continue to have Donald Trump in office, we are dealing with such levels of fascism and disregard for human life, whether it's American lives from the coronavirus or lives in Yemen, in Iran, and on and on. So another sign of hope, I would say that something that is good about Biden and that would be very different than a Trump administration, is Biden's position on the Iran nuclear deal. And I do think that he would work hard to get us back into that deal. And that is incredibly important for Iranians who are also seeing a second
Ariel,
wave.
let me interrupt you. I want to thank you for coming on. This is National Code Director at Code Pink, Ariel Gold. We will be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you again for coming on, Ariel.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of the capital, Washington, D.C. Joining us, former member of both the Louisiana State Senate and Louisiana House of Representatives, and a person who we get into arguments back and forth. They're always good-natured. Elbert Guillory. Elbert, welcome back to the show.
Good morning. It's great to be back with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me ask you this. Right now, of course, we're in election season. And I think the last time we had you on, I think it was like immediately after the pageants, the DNC and RNC pageants, if I'm not mistaken. Recently, there's been a bit of controversy with Ice Cube putting out a plan and basically making an argument that I've made. If a candidate doesn't want to represent your interests, they shouldn't get your vote. That's doubly so from the standpoint of African Americans and the political instrument. When you have 90% of a group voting to the tune, voting for a political party, and that group is basically powerless in that political party, there's something wrong. And my contention is those votes are definitely typically made out of fear, not necessarily made out of this notion of aspirational politics in regards to what you want or even what you need, but more so to keep the monsters at bay. Ice Cube and some of these other celebrities actually have been coming out saying blacks are being taken for granted, et cetera, and yet they still vote Democrat. So how do you see this? Do you see Ice Cube as being on to something? Do you think Ice Cube is right to kind of make that point? If I'm not mistaken, he even went to beat Trump. How do you frame this? I mean, you have an interesting part of the political spectrum, and you were in both houses of Congress, so you should have a pretty interesting take on this.
I think that Ice Cube is absolutely correct. Unfortunately, not enough of us see the truth. The truth is that we, black folk, have been taken advantage of by the Democrat Party. Since we vote in humongous numbers for Democrats, almost unanimously for Democrats, certainly 90%, they don't owe us anything. They don't take care of us. We're the only group in America that puts all of our eggs into one basket. Republicans haven't known us, and Democrats have taken us for granted. Fortunately, that day is over.
Is that day over? Why do you think that day is over? I mean, Joe Biden, to put this in perspective, Hillary Clinton got like 90% of the black vote. Joe Biden is going to get like 90% of the black vote. You had Sanders, who was telling people, I am going to ensure you get healthcare, education, and blacks still went and voted for Joe Biden. Why do you believe that day is over? I mean, Donald Trump has been the perfect distillation of you have nowhere else to go in regards to the way he's been this kind of figure, the specter of terror. And the next person, whether it's Ted Cruz or Tom Cotton, is going to be somebody else that they're going to use as a specter. So why do you think this is over? And what do you think impinges upon us to get that to change?
A lot of people have been really working very hard for the first time since Richard Nixon. A lot of black folk have been working hard to educate the black community. Black preachers are preaching from the pulpits about what has happened to us. And probably our condition in America has deteriorated to the point where we have to do some things, and we have to see. Education, for example. It's just absolutely rotten. Little black kids are being flushed through this rotten public school system, and they're coming out illiterate and ignorant. Same thing with jobs until Trump came along and started creating more jobs and driving down our unemployment figures. We were basically unemployed here in the land of opportunity. But so because of those conditions, black folk, I believe, are saying, wait, we've got to take a look at our options. And I believe that Trump will get at least 15% of the black vote, probably more, and that trend will continue.
And so do you think that in the long run, Albert, thank you for joining us. Do you think that will lead to a sort of equal representation of the black vote in the parties, more or less? Do you think it's going to flip to primary Republican support, or do you think this is going to merely diminish the lead that the Democrats have in terms of that demographic?
I think for now, it's only going to diminish the lead. I think that it will take another 4 years, possibly even 8 years, for us to achieve true parity in the parties, to have both Democrats and Republicans concerned about our conditions and addressing our needs.
I don't know why you...
I hope, honestly, this is a conversation we had with Margaret Kimberly, and I was hoping for the same thing. I was hoping that instead of it being a sort of one-party identity representation issue, where you have, one party representing the interests of the group and the other party not, and then effectively you have a monopoly, you have a political monopoly on that demographic, which means ultimately, like the monopoly we were talking about with Google earlier, it's its own debate, of course, but similarly, it leads to a diminution of the product. It means that party is not going to represent those interests as effectively as if they had equal representation, if they were being pushed. And ideally, in my opinion, this would be a shift away from identity politics in general towards, real economic issues, towards improving our political system, improving the efficiency of various government programs, and, potentially some left-wing policies too, like improving funding for our schools while we improve the quality of those schools, not just through funds, but through a serious analysis of those institutions. Anyway, Albert, I just wanted to say I agree with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It has been a long, dry road, political road for blacks in America. When the Republican Party got into the Goldwater years it kind of turned its back on us, and they did, because we were not there. We were not with them. We are the only group in America who has voted almost 100% with any party. No other group, not Asian Americans, not Hispanic Americans, not Jewish Americans, no other group in America has put all their eggs in one basket. And so the Democrats have not represented our interests at all. Nor have Republicans, until Donald Trump came along and started to really make some fundamental changes in education and in economics.
Albert, I know you are pushing Trump here, but I don't see it. I don't see the Trump stuff. I mean, and Trump, I don't know what percentage of vote he's going to get from African Americans, but it's not going to be 15%. Nor do I see the next Republican getting 15%. I just don't see it. I don't see the changes that would need to take place for that. It's especially not going to the Republican Party, maybe sitting out the vote. And you might have some who are punitive. And Trump may get some. Don't misunderstand me. He's getting a high percentage of the Hispanic vote for obvious reasons, the deportations under Biden and under Obama. Let me ask you this. If you needed to make inroads, if your group, the Republicans, and I would be aghast by this, but if your group needed to make severe inroads into the Democratic Party's, let's say, attachment to blacks, or blacks' attachment to the Democratic Party, how would you do it? What would be the tip of the spear to make that argument where you can peel those people off, to bring those people either onto your side or at the very least to not get them to vote Democrat?
There would be two things. One would be values. The values of the black community are not served by the Democrat politics. The black community has been godly. The attacks upon religion by the Democrats, the abortion policies, which kill almost 1 million babies a year, about 70% of those babies being black babies. Those policies do not serve us. The other thing that we do is ask black folk to look out their windows, and if they are satisfied with what they see, you can't be satisfied when you are surrounded by crumbling infrastructure, crumbling schools that don't perform at all, employment situation, the criminal justice system that does not fully serve equality. So if we just open our eyes, we will not be satisfied, and we will demand some change. And I believe that black folk are getting to that point.
I mean, just to support this point, this is from 538, the polling website. Admittedly, they got 2016 wrong, along with so many other polling aggregators, when they thought, with a degree of surety that was revealed as not justified. It was an unjustified level of surety that Hillary would win that election. In any event, they're talking here about how, while older black voters, I'm just going to quote here, while older black voters look as if they'll vote for Biden by margins similar to Clinton's in 2016, Trump's support among young black voters, 18 to 44, has jumped from around 10% in 2016 to 21% in UCLA Nationscape's polling. I'm going to stop the quote there, end quote. That's a big jump. That's an over double, more than a doubling of the support proportionately from younger voters. Now, that doesn't hold for older voters, but that's also true for younger Hispanic voters too. It's just interesting. What do you think is causing that? We could talk about the Platinum Plan. We could talk about different sides of this, but Albert, why do you think that's happening?
I think that there's a concerted effort among Hispanic voters and black voters to educate our populace to the truth, the political truth. And that truth is just that the Democrat Party has not served us. The best example is just to look at the inner cities of America. And once we get to that point of getting people to look at the circumstances, I believe that is what's responsible for the shift. I believe that shift is going to be great during this Trump election, but it's going to become much, much greater during the next 4 to 8 years.
That's fair. I mean, I do think that something is happening on the front. Like, it does seem... I think what's taking place is people look at their world, and I think, Albert, to some degree, I think that's what they're doing. I think they're looking out and they're like, this is unacceptable. This is the richest country on the planet. And this group of mine have lived in perpetual poverty. And the people who speak to us and use this kind of identity politics language as if identity politics subsumes everything else, well, these people have been kind of licking our ear without necessarily really doing anything real and material to ameliorate these issues. I mean, even trying to just get healthcare passed, like 88% Democrats back it, and you can't get Democrats to do it. So it's like, even based on your own stated values, you don't even live up to your stated values. So I do think there's that. And I think because of that, people are looking for something else. And it's just in our political system, you have two parties. And so you get that younger group that feels disenchanted, that feels taken advantage of by Democrats, and they go to the Republicans. I think that's the effect that you're getting, Albert. So I do think you're seeing this kind of jump. Yeah, you are seeing this jump in the younger demographics. Let's do this. Let's take a break. We're going to come back and we're going to be taking calls at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Our guest for today is former member of both Louisiana State and Louisiana House of Representatives, Albert Guillory. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment, Albert Guillory. He is a former member of both the Louisiana State Senate and the Louisiana House of Representatives. And by the way, you can follow Albert on Twitter at Albert Guillory. I'm just going to spell this out for you folks at home. This is ELBERT-GUILLORY. That's Albert Guillory on Twitter. Go ahead, check him out, give him a follow. Albert, thank you again for being with us. I wanted to switch, actually, to a conversation about the Platinum Plan. What effects, and this ties into the Ice Cube conversation, too. Ice Cube worked with the Trump administration. He has this contract with Black America plan, and apparently he influenced the way that the Trump administration went about going out through the initial stages of the rollout of this Platinum Plan. What do you think about this? I'm guessing that you see this as a part, not just of the Trump administration's process of reaching out to Black voters, but also core to the Trump administration itself. I'm curious, though, what's your take? What do you think of this? If you had to give this an appraisal, what's your appraisal of it?
I would give Trump an A+ on his Platinum Plan. His plan would prosecute the KKK and Antifa as terrorist organizations. With respect to Antifa, that's certainly timely. We haven't seen much from the Klan lately. He would make Juneteenth a holiday, which is nice, but of greater importance, his attempt to rebuild urban neighborhoods, bringing the highest standards of policing, bringing more school choice, a clemency project for people who have been improperly prosecuted, pardoning people who've been reformed, increasing Black home ownership in urban areas. Those are real meat and potatoes issues that change people's lives. And Ice Cube has been pushing very hard for greater access to capital. And you can see that the Platinum Plan by Mr. Trump does take into consideration those arguments by Ice Cube, and they've incorporated them into the plan. Also, the part about the policing reform, which Cube has been very vocal in pushing. I love the way that Ice Cube says that he's not following one party or another. He just says that our neighborhoods need to have their needs addressed, and whoever addresses it is the person I'll vote for. If we all did that, people would be lined up to vote for Trump, and Biden would be an afterthought in American history.
No, I think if they did that, neither candidate would get any votes. If that's what they were doing, it is appalling, and you can't be serious. Making a comparison to a fascist organization, which is the Klan, and an anti-fascist organization, which is there to be against elements like the Klan. Those are two drastically different things. I can see if you take issue with Antifa's methods in regards to some of the actions that they take. Fair enough, I do too. But there is a drastic difference between Antifa and the Klan. The Klan, and even putting those two together is this kind of political ploy of beat your wife type thing. Beyond that point, the school choice stuff, that's not beneficial to people who exist in those schools because it's not choice at all. If you have a situation where you have a rundown school, I don't necessarily see how taking a kid or two out of that community and then dumping state money into that system, as opposed to making those schools and those communities better. Meaning, I agree with you on this notion that things need to be better in the African American community. And that goes from schools, that goes to jobs, that goes to all that stuff. Agreed. I even agree with you that Democrats, for the most part, give this kind of dog and pony show without actually giving the meat and potatoes bang for the buck. Meaning it's the separation between identity versus class, and making that separation work. They've been able to con blacks into voting for them. But I don't see how Republicans are a viable outlet to that, even though I accept this premise of, I don't care who solves this problem, I just want this problem solved. Like, do you really think that the way the Republican Party is structured right now, currently, that they would be a good home or a welcoming home for African Americans and the interests and the things that we push for?
I think that it's crucial that we get school choice because while the whole system is being reformed, and it's never going to be reformed as long as the Democrat Party's kowtows to the big teacher unions, because they are against any change in the system. But until there's change in the overall system, there's no need to lock every little kid to block. It's like the old governor of Alabama standing in the doorway preventing a few black kids from going into that. Your position would be akin to his. Lock every black child into these failing schools until you can change the whole system. And that'll be decades from now. At least let some who are able to go to a charter school, let more parents get involved and create more charter schools. Biden says clearly there will be no more charter schools. A vote for Biden is a death. It's a vote for the death of charter schools and the death of vouchers. So he would, mongrel racist that he is, he would lock and block every little black kid into the worst performing schools in America, which is what urban schools are today.
I guess I'm saying if we, the state, look, I get it. But the problem is both are problems. Like, we shouldn't have failing schools in America, period.
Agreed.
And whether those failing schools are public schools, whether they're in bad neighborhoods, we shouldn't have failing schools. But here's the catch. If you have a failing neighborhood and you have a school in the neighborhood, the school is also going to fail because the neighborhood is failing. This is an issue of building up the community. Would you agree with me on that?
Absolutely agreed.
Now, I guess the catch becomes, how do you do it? And I think that's where I disagree. That's starting to creep in. I would put it this way, though. You do have a good point. That from the standpoint of waiting for Democrats to do anything on this stuff in real terms means you're waiting forever. And your argument is basically, they are never going to do anything, so save who you can save. Am I getting that right from your framing of this?
No, my position is save who we can save today, and at the same time, work to change the public school system. That was my approach when I was in the Louisiana legislature. I fought very hard, successfully, to get Louisiana state vouchers that would permit children who were in the worst performing schools and who were locked into poverty. The state would give them the money that it spends. They could take that voucher and go to any school, a private school, charter school. But at the same time, not only do we provide an escape route to kids who are locked into these schools, but we try to change the basic nature of public education, putting teachers back in charge of their classrooms and stopping some of the insane experimentation, going back to basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, those things that made America the greatest educational nation on earth 50 years ago, have to be on both tracks at the same time.
I mean, another side of this that we haven't talked about yet, just in terms of the Biden-Trump parallel dichotomy thing here. Joe Biden, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. And then that's again a paraphrase. I think very close to a direct quote from Biden.
No, that's a direct quote.
And then Trump,
if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Yeah.
That's probably a direct quote. Yeah. And then Trump, with the Platinum Plan, 500,000 new jobs for young black Americans, trying to bring depository institutions, $500 billion in capital into black communities. One of them seems to just be asking for blind allegiance. In fact, assuming blind allegiance. The other seems to be giving something. We can question how well that's going to get rolled out. We can question whether that's enough or if that's the right answer for it. But at the least, there is a policy there, a concrete policy. And if he gets reelected, it seems like he'll work on it. It seems like he'll push on that. We have no similar promise from Biden. So I guess, Jamarl, why do you think that's insufficient? Why are you, in other words, why are you sort of defending Joe Biden on this one, even though Joe Biden, as we talk about every day?
I didn't defend Joe Biden. I think I said neither. I think I said if Elbert got his way, I think neither would get voted for. No, this isn't a one or the other. My vote is neither here. I don't have a dog in this hunt. But it's not. Why didn't Trump do this the first time around? He had the House and the Senate. He had the capacity to do it. He didn't do it. So why would I believe he's going to do it in the second term? I don't believe either of these guys when they say they're going to do X or Y. I think both of them are flagrant liars. So that's my political positioning if you're asking me. But this is not a defensive one or the other. I guess I'm more so digging into the difficulty here, because I think this conversation elucidates it. That one party who talks about these concerns, I feel your pain, this language that Bill Clinton has, it's just language. It's not a reality of things. It's not a material thing where you're trying to benefit and trying to fix and trying to resolve those things. China has an anti-poverty policy, for God's sake. We don't have that. And so you get the Republicans who basically say Democrats have failed on this, and they're right. And Elbert makes this case extraordinarily well. Look outside your window. Look at, the potholes. Look at the schools. Look at these things are failing. And so that's a soothing argument, but it's like, in real terms, does anything happen on that front? And my expectation is no. I mean, am I wrong?
I think that Trump is not coming lately to the table with plans. Long ago, he developed his first step plan to help reform the criminal justice system. Long ago, he appointed a Secretary of Education who has been really pushing for the changes that we've been talking about, both in school choice and reforming the public school system. Long ago, he developed his HBCU plan, his plan for black colleges and universities to bolster them. So he didn't just get religion during election time. He's been working to advance our community from day one. On the other hand, Biden, over 47 years, including 8 years as president, has never come up with a plan or an idea to advance.
Albert, thank you so much for joining us. We've got to go. Really appreciate you being willing to speak with us here. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, unifying those states in our own weird way. In the politically independent corner, I am your analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, with my co-host Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Get me off that wall and get you off that wall too. Let's tear that wall down. We are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I got nothing against walls. I'm just playing with the metaphor there. In any event, let's get to the top news here. In the news, well, first up, in a coronavirus update, as of Tuesday, 8.2 million people in America have gotten the virus, and 220,800 people in America have died from the virus. Tuesday night's World Series opener between the LA Dodgers and Tampa Bay Rays had the lowest attendance since 1909. That's over 110 years ago. There were 11,388 attendees. Two new peer-reviewed studies, by the way, one being the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, found that mortality has dropped among hospitalized patients by 18% since the pandemic began. Now, that's an 18% total drop. That's not relative to the number. So at the start of the pandemic, patients had a 25% chance, a 25.6% chance of dying. Now that number has declined to 7.6. So again, 18% got knocked off that number, which is great. That's a good drop. Many wonder now why the heck that number was so high to begin with, what we've done, what policies we've implemented. We've had conversations with Dr. Mikhail Kogan where he said, we know about the drugs. There's been the specific drugs that were supposed to have been effective, remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, many more on that list, dexamethasone, antibody treatments, a little bit more recherche, a little bit more esoteric. But anyway, what he was saying, actually, is that there are also some fairly simple techniques that we haven't heard so much about, like laying people on their stomach instead of on their backs. So apparently that reduced the mortality rate significantly, and it seems like that would be fairly easy to do in comparison with the other. Much easier, certainly, if you can't access medication. In any event, yesterday, the Justice Department sued Google for antitrust violations, alleging that Google had abused its dominance in online search and advertising to stifle competition and harm consumers. There are ongoing investigations of other major tech companies, including Apple, Amazon, and Facebook, at both the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission. Google responded to this via tweet saying, and I quote, "Today's lawsuit by the Department of Justice is deeply flawed. People use Google because they choose to, not because they're forced to or because they can't find alternatives," end quote. And in our next headline, the Oakland City Council passed controversial new rules Tuesday night that dictate where homeless residents can and can't camp and how they must camp. The policy makes certain areas near schools, homes, and businesses mostly off limits to homeless encampments and lays out steps to move residents living there into housing or shelters and to shut down those camps. After more than 100 community members weighed in, mostly in opposition, during a passionate public comment session that lasted for hours, the Oakland City Council voted unanimously to approve the new policy. The move represents the city's first attempt to craft a set of sweeping rules to govern its unsheltered communities. It comes as camps that sprawl across sidewalks, parks, and vacant lots have pushed many Oaklanders to their breaking point. City officials are aware of 142 encampments throughout Oakland, about 70 of which have 3 or more residents, and many of which city staff says have become unsanitary and violent. And again, the thing that I'm just going to briefly note here, other than the fact that, we should be trying to take people off the streets for their own sake, is that it seems like most of the people who are pushing for this, pardon me, were doing it for their own sakes. Most of the local activists just didn't like having homeless encampments getting in their way, which, that's one side of the story. But it seems like the more relevant other side is that there are people living lives of quiet desperation on the streets. Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, is it really quiet desperation? I mean, if you can see it, it's almost experiential, just in appraisal. There's also something grotesque about the billionaire stepping over the homeless man to get into his limo to go to his, third house in the Hamptons. No, the story is problematic across the board. I mean, this puts you in the mind of the robot that they were using to try to get rid of the homeless. Did you see that? The robot would go around and it would scoop people away. Deal with the homeless problem. Like, I know this, I'm saying this because it sounds like the most straightforward way for people to not have to deal with the homeless is to get rid of the homeless. I mean, this goes back to the conversation with Albert, where we're talking about, like, you have Democrats who talk about this feel your pain stuff. But when you get into real terms, well, California is run by Democrats. And what is this? What is this? I mean, the profuse levels of poverty or profuse levels of people living on the streets. And by the way, that's only going to get worse with the evictions that are coming up after COVID and everything else. So yeah, I think this is horrendous. And, this bespeaks of a problem, an ill in your society. These are not individual people, even though they're individual people. This is something of a systemic failure. That's my take. That's what's hit.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Winston Churchill quote about democracy, except applied to the Democratic Party.
Right.
Where it's the worst form of government except for all the others. It's sort of like the Democrats are the worst party except for all the others. That's kind of how people seem to feel. Really, of course, it's just the other party that they're comparing them to, the Republicans. But
yes.
Yeah, man, situations in cities are by and large bad and getting worse.
That's grim. And if you're walking home,
it is grim.
I mean, the fear of being hit over your head by somebody who's sleeping on the street. Yeah, that's grim. I mean, like poverty, crime, all that stuff. I mean, that should not be something that if you had any ability to not have, that you should have in your society. I mean, if you're trying to get rid of crime, if you're trying to up the educational opportunity, think of how much productive energy that you waste with all of those people being out on the street like that. I mean, even putting from the level of what a human being could do, and those human beings are stuck in either poverty or, like you said, quiet desperation. That's a waste. It's a waste of resources. That's a horrible story. It's a truly horrible story.
It is. All right. You know what? Let's get through the headlines here. Next headline. For the first time, the police officer injured in Breonna Taylor's shooting death is speaking out. He was interviewed by Michael Strahan on ABC. That officer, Jonathan Mattingly, said that he felt, quote, mostly frustration, end quote, as he watched months of protests across the country in reaction to Taylor's death. Mattingly, who fired his weapon 6 times the night that Taylor died in March, said that, quote, there was so much misinformation out all these false narratives. This is not relatable to George Floyd. It's nothing like it. This is not Ahmaud Arbery. It's nothing like it. It's not a race thing like people want to try to make it to be. This is the point where we're doing our job. We return fire. This is not us hunting somebody down, not kneeling on a neck. This is nothing like that, end quote. And I think Jamarl and I agree that no matter what happens here, any new updates on this story are going to inflame tensions on either side, and in a lot of cases on both sides. And I think that holds true for this one.
Yeah, I think the guy was doing his job. I think he's probably right. That's what I mean. That's the sad part. I think he was doing his job. In his head, This is what I do on a daily basis. It went bad. Yeah. And it's going to inflame it.
Yeah. And I mean, the different ties into this too, the drug war. Anyway, Russia's foreign minister called for collective efforts Tuesday to prevent a large-scale war in the Persian Gulf and got strong support from all Security Council members except the United States. The U.S. called Iran the major culprit and urged that it had to be held accountable for supporting terrorists and destabilizing the region. Quick interjection here. The United States talking about destabilizing the region is like the pot calling the kettle an iron casket. That's a weird little inversion of that idiom. Anyway, back to the headline. Sergei Lavrov told a high-level virtual council meeting that a worst-case scenario was avoided earlier this year following the U.S. killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani, and warned that, quote, the situation remains fragile and could become dangerous and unpredictable again, end quote. But Russia, which holds the council presidency this month, believes that, quote, if we work together openly and impartially, and if we pool our political will and our creative potential, we will be able to help the states of the Persian Gulf overcome this difficult historic period and create an effective system of collective security, end quote. Robert Malley, president of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group, warned that, quote, the region-wide conflict that now looms largest across the globe is a conflict nobody apparently wants, a conflict triggered by tensions in the Gulf region, end quote. Of course, a bit further to the north, you have the conflict in Syria, and then a bit to the northeast of there, you have the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. It's a messy string of events in that sort of crescent shape there. Kyrgyzstan. Authorities in Kyrgyzstan on Wednesday set a new parliamentary election for December following a disputed vote that led to the resignation of the country's president. The October 4th parliamentary election was swept by pro-government parties, a result that the opposition dismissed as having been manipulated. Protesters took over government offices, prompting election authorities to nullify the results of the vote. Demonstrators also freed several opposition leaders, including Sadir Zaporov, who was quickly named the new prime minister. Zaporov's supporters threatened to storm government buildings, forcing President Sarunbay Jeenbekov to step down on October 15th. Zaporov succeeded him as the acting head of state. And on Wednesday, the Central Election Commission again set a new parliamentary election for December 20th. A presidential vote is expected in January in 2021. Brief headline here. Rudy Giuliani, this is part of the Hunter Biden laptop scandal/saga coming from the New York Post, started last week. Rudy Giuliani, in an appearance on Newsmax, disclosed a text message from Hunter Biden that showed the son of the former vice president, that's Joe Biden, presidential nominee, by the way, in case you haven't heard, son of the former vice president, talking with underage girls while on crack. Apparently also had pictures on his phone, like nude pictures of a 14-year-old that he was talking to. That's illegal and immoral, in case you were wondering. Giuliani said that he had turned over the evidence to the Delaware State Police. And my last headline here, not my headline actually, but I really like it. A NASA spacecraft briefly touched the surface of an asteroid, attempted to collect a sample of extraterrestrial rocks, and then successfully propelled itself away in a history-making mission on Tuesday. The OSIRIS-REx, that's an acronym for Origins, Spectral Interpretation, Resource Identification, and Security Regolith Explorer, was attempting a touch-and-go sample collection on the asteroid Bennu, the first mission of its kind for NASA. Prior to Tuesday, only Japan had successfully obtained an asteroid sample. All preliminary information indicates that the sample collection was a success, but NASA teams warned ahead of the event that it could take days to know for sure if the spacecraft obtained asteroid samples. The spacecraft launched 4 years ago and has been orbiting Bennu for 2 years. On Tuesday, it briefly touched its surface with a robotic arm around 6:12 p.m. Eastern Time, grabbing a sample in less than 1 minute. That sounds almost acrobatic. That spacecraft is expected to remain in Venu's orbit until 2021, when it will begin its journey home, landing back on Earth with the sample sometime in 2023. And with that, you've listened to our headlines on Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. I'm going to be honest, Jamarl. There's something poetic to me about a spacecraft. You know, this spacecraft specifically, the OSIRIS-REx. It's a good name for a spacecraft orbiting an asteroid and then just briefly touching down with a single arm for less than a single minute to get some samples. There's just something like somebody pirouetting, a robot pirouetting in space with an asteroid, and then it'll return home to bring us back some samples of rock.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
No, it's beautiful when you think about it, right? Like, I'm a sucker for this type of stuff. Yeah, it's beautiful when you think about it. I mean, at some point, at least this sets the concept of having these robots out there mining materials, supplies, automatically, and at which point it deposits back to Earth, in which case it goes back out, gets materials, supplies, you know. I mean, at that point, you're talking about like a space elevator and stuff like that in order to bring the supplies back to Earth without having ships going up and down. But no, it's beautiful. I mean, we could be spending our time doing this. Imagine if instead of people making $2 a day, like instead of having all of this ensconced poverty around the world, that those people were scientifically literate, those people could get an education to the degree that they wanted, all that stuff. And even though it's not going to be all, even if you got like 3% of them that ended up in science and technology, imagine what that does to our planet. So yeah, I agree with you. But this is Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. Going to get into some robot poetics. We will be back in a moment. Stay tuned.
Fault Lines.
No Kim just yet.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to us, apparently. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and we're having a conversation about big tech and censorship and antitrust. And specifically, this is following, of course, the Justice Department rolling out its antitrust lawsuit against Google yesterday. In my opinion, that's much ado about nothing. But thankfully, we've got somebody else's opinion. Kim Iverson is joining us, independent journalist and host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. Kim, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. I'm good.
Good to hear. Good. I am also now on the West Coast. I'm up in the Bay Area, and it's freaking crazy early. I'm getting up at like 2:33 in the morning. If I remember correctly, you keep a pretty tight schedule. You get up fairly early as well. At least I can tell you're up early because, you know, you're on the air with us now. Anyway, before we get into the news, how's stuff going?
Things are good. Things are, relatively, things are good. Wondering how the holiday season is going to go coming up. But, with the current state that we're in, as far as the second wave of the virus coming around. So, but otherwise, yeah, things are good.
Cool. Good to hear. All right. We're talking about the antitrust lawsuit filed by the Department of Justice yesterday against Google. This is Alphabet Inc.'s Google. And Jamarl and I were going back and forth on this earlier in the morning during our headline segment. I mean, he was, saying they're a big tech company. They do have a monopoly on search. And therefore, in some sense, I don't want to misrepresent you, Jamarl, but that does seem pretty accurate. And therefore, in some sense, we have some legitimacy in going after them. My take was there are these two other sides of it. One is, I think, and this is your take too, this is effectively the government pressuring big tech companies, specifically Google, to continue to suppress political speech, to continue to guide political speech effectively through the sort of soft nudging and sometimes even hard suppression and shadow banning process. And this other take is it's just a way to extract money. I mean, on the other side of this, what we very well may say and see, in fact, what I predict we will see, is Google coming out effectively more or less the same, maybe with a corporate restructuring or something like that, but still an economic and technological powerhouse in their own way, but having to give the government billions or tens of billions of dollars, something like that. Kim, what's your take? Where do you think this is going to go, and why do you think this is happening?
Well, I think it's happening because in 2016, the Democrats couldn't believe that they lost the election. And they still have never gotten over that. They just want to continue to blame it on they started off by blaming it on the Russians. And that is where this really started. It was this whole, we have to control the internet because the internet now is meddling. Bad actors are able to use the internet in order to meddle in our elections and hinder American democracy is the claim. And because it was according to the Democrats, the Russian bots or Russian bad actors that were able to use the internet and use our social media sites, they started going after the internet. They started going after the internet providers, social media providers. And I think any of us could agree that, maybe these social media sites did need to do more. Google or Facebook or, Twitter or whoever that we're all kind of using to engage and using to find information, that maybe they should do a better job of ensuring that, it's a real human behind the information and not just a swarm of, Russian bot algorithms or whatever. I mean, maybe we could get on board with saying, we got to do something to eliminate the ability for a hacker or for a group or an entity to get in there and manipulate it to where it looks like it's 1,000 people talking to us and it's really one guy in his mom's basement in Moscow. Okay, we can maybe get on board with that, but it then morphed to we've got to do something to stop liars. And that liar could be your aunt, your American aunt. That liar could be your next door neighbor. That liar could be your coworker. It kind of morphed into this new, we have to just stop the spread of misinformation, not just misinformation coming from non-human bots that are used to attack us specifically. So this is really has been a result of Democrats not being able to accept the 2016 election, and we are all paying the price with our freedoms because the Democrats are claiming that our freedoms are under attack. And it is very clearly the Democratic side that's doing this and putting the pressure on. So that's really where I think it comes from.
I've heard Elizabeth Warren make statements that have been terrifying, talking about locking people up for lying and that type of stuff. So I agree with you in part that the Cambridge Analytical stuff, the Facebook and Twitter ads, the majority of which took place after the election, that seemed to put a bullseye on social media companies. But I can't necessarily say it's entirely just Democrats. I mean, Trump has been screaming Section 230, basically, calling these guys, wants to make them, instead of platforms, publishers, which would just break the internet. I mean, screaming Section 230 is basically tantamount to cutting the heads off of Twitter or Facebook because it would fundamentally change how they operate and they wouldn't be able to operate in that section. Ted Cruz, same thing. Going after them, saying they're suppressing conservative content. And so it doesn't seem to be just one. It seems to be both. And to piggyback that, is there any justification at all? Let's say just from outside, just looking at it, is there any justification for an antitrust lawsuit? Let's say they were the most impartial people on the planet. Would impartial people still come to the conclusion that these companies are too powerful in the way that they go about their business affairs?
Well, first of all, I think the Republicans calling for the repeal of Section 230 is not because, for them, I think the reason why they're saying it, we've got to get rid of Section 230, is because they're saying you shouldn't have those protections because you're not operating under the parameters that were laid out for you to receive these protections. It is very clear, I think, at this point that these, especially Facebook and Twitter, and maybe even now Google, are not acting, Facebook and Twitter for sure, are not acting as service providers. They are acting as publishers. They have been acting as publishers by moderating content, by removing content, putting disclaimers on content, limiting content. So I think the difference is, I think it's important to distinguish why both Democrats and Republicans are calling for Section 230 to be revisited, because Democrats are also calling for the revisiting of Section 230, but Republicans more so right now. But the difference is in the reason as to why. And Democrats want to revisit Section 230 because they say, you're not going far enough in our book to stop the spread of misinformation. You're not going far enough to stop the lies. And so we think that, maybe we should threaten you with potentially being held accountable if you're not going to do more to censor under the good faith, or it's actually called the Good Samaritan clause under the Section 230, which allows social media giants to remove they're allowed to remove obscene and offensive content, even if it's protected speech, so long as they do it in good faith. That's what the clause says. And the Democrats are saying you need to do more of that. But I don't know if you and I would agree that, maybe somebody telling even a lie, I don't think is offensive or obscene content. But Republicans are saying they want to get rid of Section 230 because they're saying you don't deserve the protection anymore. I mean, you're clearly not acting in a way where you should be protected, so therefore you should not be protected. I actually kind of agree with that. If they're not going to act in a way that is within the bounds of what Section 230 lays out, they should not have Section 230 protections. If they want to maintain Section 230 protections, they need to be a service provider. So, yeah,
they need to act like a platform. They need to be less biased. They need to not try to editorialize and do the. I mean, it's not just editorialization. We actually haven't touched on this yet during this conversation here. The Hunter Biden stories from the New York Post last week, with Twitter actually effectively hiding 6 of the tweets from the New York Post. A friend of mine had this take, and I think this is true. In some sense, that's a big shift in terms of the media power dynamics in the United States. You have the New York Post, I believe, founded by Alexander Hamilton, long storied history, no matter what you think of it now, getting overrun successfully by a social media company, by a new tech company. So that's interesting in itself. But again, just returning to the conversation about Section 230, I think you're absolutely right. I think the fact that they're editorializing, the fact that they're doing these forms of political manipulation for political purposes, and very clearly for political purposes too, that does lead you to wonder what's actually going on here. And, should we change the law? It's also, I think you're right in the way that you're painting it, with the Democrats basically trying to justify more manipulation of speech on these platforms and the Republicans trying to justify less. It's an interesting dynamic. Anyway, Kim, just wanted to step in there for a second.
Yeah, I mean, it is very strange to me. I've always, I don't know. Sometimes I just wonder, I have to go back in history 20 years and wonder, back when I've always been more, liberal, and my family's always been Democrat. And I just kind of go back 20 years and I think, have I always been under this fog of thinking that they were really the party of freedom, and it turned out that they weren't as much as I thought? I don't know. Or has it changed? I have to go back and think, has the Democratic Party changed? Or did I just not notice 20 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever? Sometimes I just have these moments where I wonder. But it is definitely the Democrats that are going after, saying, no, we want more of this censorship. We want you to stop. Could you imagine? I mean, what did we do before social media when your neighbor could tell you whatever they wanted to tell you and you had to go and look it up in a library. I mean, they're acting like people telling lies is new, and you have to figure out, and you need to be protected from these lies they're going to tell you. Otherwise, you're going to believe it. And it's like, what did you do 50 years ago before social media and before warnings, trigger warnings, and false news or fake news, fact checks or whatever? I mean, snake oil salesmen have been around forever. And now suddenly they act like snake oil salesmen are an existential threat to our society. That is not true. People eventually figure out who the liars are, and they stop believing them. These guys don't want to.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I thought you were stopping. I'm sorry. No, I was going to say I agree with that.
I was just going to say that, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I agree. I think I agree with both of you. Republicans are trying to get, basically, to kill it because they want more. And Democrats are trying to kill it because they want to stop you from getting additional information, which is weird. It's so weird. Let's do this. We have Kim Iverson, independent journalist and host of Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. Let's take a break. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you are digging what Shane and I are putting down, definitely, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us a like and share that content. If you want to call in, we are taking calls during this segment, so you can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So, Kim, let's get back into the election stuff. I think I agree with both of you that Democrats have been taking this pretty strident stance of trying to shut down speech. Whether that is online, whether that's, like I mentioned before, Warren talking about prosecuting companies or whatever. So yeah, I think I can agree with that. I think my issue is with if something is put out and Republicans are like, yeah, we want to expand the level of speech. But is it expand the level of speech or expand the level of lying? And is there a difference in regards to, let's say, the dissemination of information, if the information is intentionally false or if the information is intentionally there for political reasons, to obfuscate truth? Meaning, is there a weird, and maybe this is double advocate, so fair enough, but is there a weird intersection, almost an odd dialectic in the sense that the very fact of Democrats trying to get rid of information and Republicans saying we want to expand it, but we want to expand it in a way that basically adds in ridiculousness, that both of those things equal up to the same point of the public being bewildered and not having the information that they need, that both political parties are using this to their ends to obfuscate from certain information?
I mean, I'm not sure, I'm sure that there have been some outright lies that have come from the Republican side, but, whenever I look at things, I always just see that now they just put their spin on it, on a story, not necessarily flat out lie, but just put their take on it. And they're allowed their take. They're allowed their spin, just like the left is allowed their spin, or liberal media, I should say, or establishment media is allowed their spin. And if somebody does outright lie, like, Trump he's definitely a showman, and he definitely likes to say shocking and outrageous things. I think he gets a kick out of it, which is really something that should not be happening from the president of the United States. But he, look, the way to combat bad information is more information, not less information. And even if Republicans just wanted to go out on absolute lies, which, I don't know. I feel like both sides lie the same amount. So, one side is just pointing the finger at the other, saying you're liars, but the other side lies just as much. I watch them lie all the time, right, through their teeth. It's just that the Republicans aren't pointing their fingers at them and saying, oh, you're a bunch of liars. They haven't made that their battle cry. So, I don't think there should ever be any control over the information at all. I think we have to trust that people will eventually find out, somebody, like, for example, let me tell you this really funny story. This was, I don't know, 10 years ago, or maybe before that, 10, 15 years ago, Joe Biden was I think it was Obama's first term. I was getting a massage from one of those massage places like Massage Envy or something. And this guy was from Italy, the guy that was working on me, and he's sitting there and he's fresh from Italy. And he says, oh my God, did you hear the news about Joe Biden? And I was like, what? And he says, oh, I guess, everywhere they travel, him and Obama, he says everywhere they travel, he goes into these arcades and he seeks out this one particular video game, and he plays the video game. And when he loses, he gets so mad, he starts smashing the video game, and he beats it up and smashes it and ruins it, like commits, crimes. And he was like, I can't believe it, Joe Biden, of all people. He's like, I'm so shocked when I read the news. And he goes quiet for a second, and I'm like, wow, no, I haven't heard that. And he says, yeah, I read it in The Onion. He was he did not know that The Onion was satire, had no clue. He'd been reading The Onion for however, since he'd gotten to America, and believed everything in The Onion as real news. And I had to then, of course, be the one to tell him, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But actually The Onion, and the good thing, I was like face down on the table. The guy couldn't see my face because, otherwise I would have made him feel so stupid, right? The look on my face, I'm sure, was just utter shock and like, wow. But I had to tell him The Onion is not real. Eventually people are going to tell you lies. You're going to believe fake stories. And even if it's comedy, and then fast forward, somebody's going to have to tell you, oh no, that's not true. And if enough people tell you that's definitely not true, you'll say, oh, wow, okay, they lied. I mean, like I was just saying earlier, I'm having this moment where I'm wondering, for the last 20 years, have I been believing something that's not true, or have things changed? I don't know. I have to go back in my memory and kind of figure it out. So eventually, I think people hit those points. And
I think it happens through conversation too. I think it happens. We got a couple of callers, so I want to go to them. But I think you're right, and I think frankly, the way to deal with this is not to have these. You can go back to the history. I mean, whether it's priests or potentates historically spreading lies, spreading fabrications, spreading myths and mistruths in different forms, trying to organize society. You get different forms of media in the last couple of hundred years that sort of centralize the spread of that information. And now you have the internet, which is it has the potential to be both incredibly centralizing and decentralizing in terms of how information gets disseminated. We're seeing both sides of that. We're seeing massive social media companies that can, effectively control the flow of speech through algorithms. And at the same time, you're seeing, little cracks in that all over the place, and people creating their own platforms. And you have both ends of that. Anyway, we've got a few calls I want to get to. Whale calling in from New York. Whale, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hi, Ken. I wanted to ask you, whenever these social media censorship discussions come up, the thing no one really talks about is like the lobby group behind the censorship, like the ADL, APAC, or the various other groups, they're the real ones behind the censorship. Like people talk about like right-wing conservatives being censored and all that. It's not really that. It's just like anti-war, like or talking about Israel or like the actual things going on in the world. Those are the things that are getting censored, regardless if you're lefty or right-wing. And that's, I believe, the thing that really points on is the lobby groups behind the censorship. It's not really if you're right-wing or left-wing. That's probably the main force behind the censorship.
I think it's about the politicians not wanting to lose. You know, this is like a vying for power from the politicians. But I do think that the lobby is, you know, of course the lobbies are very powerful and they definitely influence what the politicians focus on for sure. But I would say, you know, I would definitely the calls for censorship seem to come more from the left, but there are some instances of it, I think, also coming from the right. It just depends on the lobby group in that regard. But I think this has more to do with, you know, politicians, they want to remain in power so that they can do the lobbyist bidding. But if they're not in power, they can't do anything for the lobbies.
Yeah, I
They've
agree
got
with
to
you,
stay
Kim.
in office.
I agree with you. I think the censorship stuff is more to keep their power. I mean, when Hillary Clinton lost that race, they seemed, what the book was named, shattered, right? They were shattered. And, you know, from their perspective, Huffington Post had Hillary Clinton winning, 98% to 2, the chances on the night that she lost. And yeah, I think they freaked out. I think the political instrument under normal circumstances could constrain news. You had the main media channels or whatever. And they realized in 2016 that they lost the ability to constrain that news. Now, mind you, they came to erroneous conclusions. Oh, Twitter and Facebook and Russia and all this other stuff. Or Cambridge Analytica did, you know, XYZ. I think you are right that their perspective of this and their appraisal of the problem was that social media is out of control. I think that's the way they saw it. And I don't necessarily think that was true. I think in their situation, they just want to win. And this stuff is just kind of fallout from them being able to win. How do you frame the race right now, by the way? In fact, there's one more call. Let's go to Lou in Missouri while he's here. Lou, what's going on?
I said a few quick things to touch on. One, I want to point out, I've noticed that the Biden campaign isn't trying to meet with, you know, like Dr. Darity or Heather McGhee or Cornel West or Barbara Lee or really any black person, whether they're a political scientist, academic or otherwise, that might disagree with them on a fundamental policy level and has the background that would allow them to crush his centrist talking points in real time. And I also want to mention that no one that made disingenuous mentions about reparations during the primary have said much to anything about it since it was clear that it was down to Biden and Bernie, and reparations can no longer be used as a cudgel to fabricate this notion of Bernie having a problem with black people. And another point that I wanted to make is that with regard to social media censorship, it seems like what people are going for in terms of there being no types of well, I guess my question with that is, why is it okay for workplace censorship of political beliefs or lawsuits or anything like that? Why is that okay? Because, you know, once you enter that private entity space, you have to forfeit some measure of your constitutional rights. But on social media, it's supposed to be a free-for-all, and, you know, we're supposed to be able to block that on social media. Like, social media is they're still private entities. Like, even though it's used as the kind of go-to now for the public square, you can still go to a public square. You can still go and meet at a library or city hall and have political discourse. But Twitter or Facebook don't owe you anything. They're private entities, and when you enter their private space, you have to abide by their rules. I don't understand why it's different for workers versus people who are using those platforms.
Thanks for the call, Lou. You're breaking up on us, but I think I get the gist of it. Kim, he's making the point that when you're on Twitter or you're on Facebook, that basically you're using a private entity. I mean, look, that in and of itself is problems, right? I mean, our commons have been destroyed. You can go to a library, yes, but you and the 10 people in the library is not the same in our new technical era where somebody can have 100,000 or 1 million followers on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. How do we fix that? Because that is an issue. I mean, that is something to be said for us and the public losing our commons and our ability to speak and talk and interact with one another. And those things are subject to the whims of a private entity, or for that matter, the federal government.
Well, I mean, I think, so the argument, that's always the argument, is that, well, they're private companies, they can do whatever they want. And that is not totally true. I mean, you look at your whoever provides you your electricity is also probably a private company. And whoever's providing you with your telephone is probably also a private company.
Even a shop owner not allowing a person who's of color to come into a store. They're even telling that shop owner, look, you still have to let the person come to the store regardless of the color.
Yeah, if you're open for business, you're open for business, right? So the question is, what kind of business are you? And if Facebook and Twitter and these guys are saying that they are just platforms to allow people to connect and people to say whatever they want to say, then they have to remain that way. They have to remain providers. But it's when they cross over into publishers. They're allowed to be private providers, and they're also allowed to be private publishers. But they do have to make a choice as to what their business model is going to be. But also when it comes to followers, this is the other argument when people say, well, okay, you can have a private conversation on the phone line that you got from the private telephone company. That's private. But when you've got social media, you've got a lot more people that you're broadcasting out to. Those people have to choose to follow you still. I'm not automatically following people. I don't have a Twitter account anymore, but if I did, I have to choose who I follow. I have to choose who I friend on Facebook. I have to choose even who I subscribe to on YouTube. But YouTube, it's a little bit of a different algorithm, so I can kind of understand a little bit more, because of the suggested videos, I suppose. But when, Facebook and Twitter for sure, I mean, they're trying to silence your uncle, and your uncle is somebody who's on who's in your friend group on Facebook, and your uncle wants to share an article with you. And they're saying, no, your uncle cannot have that essentially private conversation with his friends and family on Facebook. I mean, that is obviously a problem.
Clearly, they're going to get involved in Thanksgiving dinner. Kim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Always fun.
Yeah, always fun. Always great conversations. For those listening, that was Kim Iversen, independent journalist and host of The Kim Iversen Show on YouTube, which you can, by the way, watch on youtube.com/Kim Iversen. By the way, that is spelled IVERSEN. Again, Kim Iversen Show, youtube.com/Kim Iversen. We're back in a minute taking calls, 202-521-1320, talking about big tech censorship stuff. We might roam a little bit, but we'll see. But again, if you want to call in, you can, 202-521-1320. Back in just a minute, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increase activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we're taking your calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our phone number, in case you would like to call it, is 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, thank you for the call. What's on your mind?
Good morning, gentlemen. The key word is minimal in the year 2016. The people that are surrounding Trump, they are keeping him busy by going to these campaign rallies, talking to his constituents, the people that already got his support. Now, I know this is the third, fourth day I'm constantly bringing this up, but I realize something. They got him at a minimal. Well, if he do win the election, it's not going to be by that much. If he lose, then they can turn around and say, well, you lost because of the liberal media and you got the mail-in bowl and so did Trump. But the thing is this. He got to reach out beyond his campaign crew and the people around him. You know, he got to reach beyond that and start looking at Glass-Steagall, start looking at legalization of marijuana for medical use, and stopping these inventions and going beyond. He got to pull from the left like he did in 2016.
He's not doing that.
And independent.
He's not doing it.
Jamal, he has to do that if he want to win.
Yeah, I know, but I get that.
In a landslide.
Look, I get that. Wait. I get that. But the New York Times has done articles on this stuff, talking about behind the scenes. This is not a factor of Trump's campaign. This is a factor of Trump. Trump likes doing those rallies. Trump believes that the rally is the thing that shows support and everything else. That's him. That's not the people around him.
Well, Jamal, they just had an article I just saw that the White House is just pressuring, thank God, the Pentagon, which it should have been did, to pull the troops out of Afghanistan. So apparently somebody's talking to him and is getting through his head right now. Well, now he's starting to pull from the troops out of Afghanistan. Now it's going to help him out the libertarians and maybe a couple of leftists and moderates and independents, you know. But at the same time, he has to go beyond. You saying it's him? We don't know that. He has to go beyond and start pulling from the left and independents and moderates. Or it's going to be Joe Biden will beat him, or he'll better beat Joe Biden. Then within 2 or 3 days, Joe Biden going to wind up winning anyway with the mail-in ballot. They keeping Trump to a minimum. Well, if they lose, it's not really their fault, you know. Or if he win, they say, well, yeah, you won because you constantly going, you know, talking to your base and stuff, and you left the leftists alone and the independents alone. But they will win both ways. But the thing is this, he need to go beyond his campaign managers and the people surrounding them.
Wait, Tarif, there's one part of this that I don't understand about what you're saying. Are you talking about from Trump's campaign manager's perspective, from the inside? Pardon me. They're basically trying to keep him limited. They're trying to keep him engaged with his base, stuck within a certain range of issues. And what you're saying is that for Trump to win in a landslide, for him to be a great president, he would need to expand well beyond what that base wants. He needs to start getting into stuff like you're talking about. I mean, not necessarily specifically those issues, but issues of that magnitude. Is that right?
Yes. But look, when Nixon won back in late 60s, early 70s, Nixon started expanding his campaign. Yes, he did use the Southern strategy. He didn't just use that. He went after the unions in the North, Michigan, Wisconsin, New York. He started talking to the unions, okay? And he started pulling, the working class people, all right? And he pulled black people too, okay? So Trump have to broaden his appeal again. He have to do it again. 2016, that's why he won. I don't see the old Trump. I see this new Trump that's being, pigeonholed, that's being cornered in a corner somewhere where they're limiting him to the minimal, and he have to go to the maximum. He have to start saying, look, Medicaid or something, single payer or something, legalization of marijuana, Glass-Steagall or something. You have to. If you want to pull the rest of the people into his camp, you have to.
2 weeks.
I just thought about this.
You have 2 weeks left? 2, maybe 3 before the election. I don't know how Trump is going to do look, he can legalize pot, I suppose. He can, take it off the Schedule 1 drugs or whatever. But I mean, the issue is this other stuff that you're talking about. If he was going to do it, he would have done it by now. And look, this could have been a fundamentally different presidency. When Trump got in office, there was a tiny morsel of me that thought maybe, because they hate him, maybe he'll be something separate and distinct. Like maybe, he might pull back the troops, but maybe he gives tax cuts. Maybe he says, let's do something about healthcare, but he screws something else up. Like maybe it was going to be that, but that's not what he was. He ended up being a neocon for all intents and purposes, with the exception of, the foreign stuff. Yeah, the war. He hasn't started any new wars.
I've got a controversial proposal here. Tarif, thank you for the call. I think Trump should choose you as his new campaign manager. I think that right now he chooses you as his campaign manager. Within the next 2 weeks, he would do a complete turnaround. I think you're right. If he started to push on some of this stuff, he would win in a landslide. We've got to go to our next caller, though. Tarif, thank you for the call. Great calls, as always. Brave, calling in from Atlanta. You're on. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, guys. I tweeted out to you guys' Twitter page a link from a Sky News Australia interview with Steve Bannon. I'm not sure if you guys probably didn't see my tweet, but I'm not sure if you guys saw that interview where Bannon went into the fact that the FBI supposedly had the Hunter Biden's laptop since 2019, and they implied, basically, he outright said that they held it back, and had they not, that would have changed the Democratic primary, the terrain of the Democratic primaries, basically because all the information when it came out, which would have ideally would have hurt Biden, allowing people like Bernie or whoever else to come to the forefront, which would suggest that, as we've seen in the past and continuing, that the FBI worked along with the Democratic Party to suppress that information. And if you guys haven't seen it, maybe check it out. I'd love to get your input on it, or just get your overview of what you think about it. And then the second thing
I want to watch that. I've heard that. No, I haven't watched that. I haven't watched that in an interview. We actually, Jamarl and I think had a conversation about that off air the other day. But yeah, the FBI reportedly got this stuff back in 2019. They've been holding on to it. And there are a couple different directions you can go on this. I've seen people criticizing Bannon for saying that, criticizing Bannon and Giuliani, basically saying, well, if they had it for a year, if they knew it was on it for a year, why didn't they come forward? Does that make them complicit in pedophilia or whatever the most extreme crimes were going on that Hunter Biden was engaged in? That's just lunatic, but it's cognitive dissonance. Apparently they're ignoring the fact that the FBI had it. Yeah. And if there's stuff there, they really should have pursued it. That is the thing. And of course, this brings back to mind 2016 and Comey and Hillary's emails and that whole thing. Feels like ancient history at this point. The last couple of years has been like a black hole with time in terms of all the stuff that's been going on. No, I want to watch that. I want to watch that interview, though. Thank you for the recommendation there.
Yeah.
Great.
He has a good point, right? I mean, the FBI had it all the time. But, Bannon and Giuliani, they could have released it too. I mean, I think the thing is, like I said before, this comes across as a political operation where you have a shop owner that your hands aren't on it. Come out and say, okay, this is what I have. It is a good question to ask, though. Why didn't the FBI come out with it? And like you said, I was reading the Giuliani thing that he came out with on Newsmax. If the FBI has the stuff, shouldn't they comment? Shouldn't they do something? I mean, I don't know. The catch is it true? And I think to me, that's all that really matters. And at this point, who knows? Biden seems to be real quiet on this. Shane?
Sorry, it sounded like you cut out for a second there.
No, Biden is super quiet. I just said Biden is real quiet on this.
Yeah, and then you got real quiet yourself. Pardon me. Biden is super quiet on this, and that's notable. Yeah, that silence is noteworthy. I mean, he's not wanting to address it, probably because there's some truth to it. That's certainly the assumption of anybody who's paying attention to this stuff. And it all is hopefully going to come out tomorrow night. Hopefully, that will be the entertainment of the year in some sense. But we'll see. Again, the Democrats could be trying to drop something between now and tomorrow too, or the whole thing could be called off because Biden contracts COVID or some nonsense like that. I don't know. Not to try to diminish. If he got it, that would be very bad for him. That's not trying to make light of that, but he is keeping quiet on it.
Yeah, it's just strange. That's all. I mean, somebody's accusing your son of a lot of stuff. It's also a secondary question on whether or not, if your kid is doing this, what does that have to do with you? Like, don't get me wrong, the Burisma stuff definitely hits Biden. But if your kid is a crackhead, what does that have to do with you and your administration? I mean, it seems to only matter if it's some kind of
your
influence.
Parenting.
Well, there's that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the sort of thing that people don't apparently want to talk about here. When we're looking at this stuff, a lot of what we talk about includes us too. We're looking for like evidence of clear corruption. Like, did Joe Biden break the law somewhere by working with his son, by working with Burisma, by working with China, whatever? We're looking for that stuff. But there's also just a larger argument. He apparently was a pretty bad parent in some sense. He did not know how to like successfully navigate the process of guiding his kid to the point where his kid didn't become a crack addict and maybe a pedophile. Like, that's bad. And then if Biden knew about it and didn't do anything about it, didn't act on this stuff over the decades that this has been happening, that's also bad. And I think that for a lot of people, it might be subliminal. They might feel that unconsciously. That is going to come to mind. They're going to feel that. In any event, we've got to close out today's show. Thank you, all of our listeners, for listening. Thank you, engineer Andre. Thank you, producers Cam and Raheem. And thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. We're doing a great job. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Signing off for today. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you again tomorrow morning.
All right, guys. I want to thank all of you for joining us again. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I am going to have to sign off a little bit earlier than normal because Mrs. Thomas has to get her teeth fixed. And me being a great husband is going to go there with her. Marcus Will, thank you, Marcus Will. Pop Reality, Biden asking for Republicans. I'm done. Democratic Party's dead. We need to register as independent campaigns. Yes, agreed. 1000% agree. Hilarious watching lefties defend corporate Google. I know, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't. Is there anything to be said for antitrust legislation? Yay or nay? And if there is something to be said for antitrust legislation, is this one of the cases? They went after Microsoft. Google seems to be the poster boy for monopoly. Yeah, I don't see the justification to not do it, with the exception of the outcome. If the outcome has a situation that's worse, and I mean worse meaning from the standpoint of people being able to use the system and that type of stuff, then maybe it's not the best thing. But if we're talking about whether or not, and if the question falls solely on whether or not Google is a monopoly, whether they got there because their product was just radically better than other people's product, or whether they got there through one deal after the next, well, if you come to the same conclusion of yes, and we abhor monopolies, then clearly something has to be done. The catch is what? And I have no clue. I want to say like, share, and subscribe.